For 8 years, Jonas McCade sat alone at that corner table, his silence as thick as the whiskey in his glass. The townspeople knew better than to approach the haunted cowboy who'd traded his marshal's badge for a life of solitude. But on a rain-soaked October night in 1878, everything changed when a woman in a travel-stained green dress walked through those saloon doors and sat down without asking permission. What happened next would transform two broken souls and remind an entire town what redemption looked like. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The autumn rain hammered against the wooden planks of the Silver Spur Saloon like bullets against a tin roof, each drop a sharp reminder that winter was coming early to Montana territory. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke, the smell of cheap whiskey, and the unwashed bodies of miners and ranch hands seeking refuge from the storm. Lantern light flickered across weathered faces, casting dancing shadows that made the whole establishment feel like something caught between the living world and a memory. At the corner table, the one farthest from the door, closest to the back exit, Jonas McCade sat with his back to the wall, exactly as he had every night for the past 8 years. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't touched it anyway. The plate before him held the remnants of beef stew, more pushed around than eaten, a ritual of pretending to need a reason to occupy his claimed space. He was a tall man, would have been over 6 feet if he ever stood up straight, but Jonas McCade had spent the better part of a decade trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, as if he could fold his guilt into a package tight enough to disappear. His face was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with eyes the color of storm clouds that hadn't seen joy in so long they'd forgotten what it looked like. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, fell past his collar, unkempt but somehow deliberately so, as if caring about his appearance might suggest he still cared about living. The conversations around him flowed like creek water over stones, meaningless, constant, something to fill the silence. Jonas didn't participate. He hadn't participated in 8 years. The other patrons had learned to treat his table like hallowed ground, a place where a ghost sat nightly to commune with his demons. "Another round, McCade?" Tommy Brennan, the young bartender, called out the same question he asked every night, already knowing the answer. Jonas shook his head once, a minimal movement that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal. "Suit yourself," Tommy said, turning his attention to more profitable customers. The storm outside intensified, wind howling through the gaps in the walls like tortured spirits. The saloon doors swung open, admitting a blast of cold air and rain that made the lanterns sputter and dance. Everyone looked up, as they always did when someone entered, that primal instinct to identify friend or threat. The woman who stood in the doorway was soaked to the bone, her green traveling dress darkened almost to black by rainwater, her auburn hair plastered to her face and neck. She carried a single carpet bag in her left hand and nothing else. No umbrella, no coat, nothing that suggested she'd been prepared for this journey or this storm. She looked like someone who'd run from something or towards something with equal desperation. For a long moment, she simply stood there, water pooling at her feet, her chest rising and falling with the deep breaths of someone who'd been walking for miles. Her eyes, and Jonas found himself noticing despite his best efforts, were an unusual hazel, green in some lights, gold in others, and in this moment, illuminated by firelight and determination, they held something Jonas hadn't seen in a face for years: absolute, unshakable resolve. "Sweet Jesus," someone muttered. "That's the new school teacher." The murmur spread through the saloon like wildfire. The new school teacher. They'd been expecting her for weeks, ever since the territorial governor had sent word that he was finally assigning someone to Silverdale's long-abandoned schoolhouse. But they'd expected a stagecoach arrival, a proper introduction, not this half-drowned woman appearing like a ghost from the storm. Eleanor Graves, because that's who she was, though Jonas didn't know her name yet, surveyed the room with those remarkable eyes, taking in every face, every space, calculating. The saloon was packed to capacity. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder at tables meant for half their number. The bar 3 deep with patrons seeking warmth and whiskey in equal measure. Every seat was taken. Every seat except one. Her gaze found Jonas's table, found the 3 empty chairs surrounding his solitary figure, found the way everyone instinctively avoided that corner as if an invisible fence cordoned it off from the rest of human society. Jonas felt her eyes on him and looked up from his cold coffee. For 8 years, he'd perfected the art of the dismissive glance, the look that told people they weren't welcome, that their presence was an intrusion, that whatever they wanted to ask or say should remain forever unspoken. He'd sent away well-meaning widows, curious children, even the traveling preacher who'd tried to save his soul. His refusal was a wall, impenetrable and absolute. He deployed that look now, meeting Eleanor Graves's eyes across the crowded saloon, fully expecting her to turn away, to find somewhere else to be, to understand without words that his table was not an option. She started walking toward him. The saloon fell quiet, conversations dying mid-sentence as every eye tracked her movement across the sawdust-covered floor. Her boots squelched with each step, leaving wet footprints like breadcrumbs marking a path into forbidden territory. She wove between tables with surprising grace for someone who'd just walked through hell's own rainstorm, her carpetbag bumping against her leg with each stride. Jonas straightened slightly, his right hand moving instinctively toward his hip where his gun used to hang, a gesture so ingrained from his years as a lawman that even 8 years of civilian life hadn't erased it. But there was no gun there now. Hadn't been since the day he turned in his badge and walked away from everything he'd been. Eleanor Graves reached his table and stood there, water dripping from her hem to pool on the floor, her chin raised in challenge or determination or some combination of both. Up close, Jonas could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with a spray of freckles across her nose that the rain had somehow made more prominent. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, not from anger, but from the effort of not shivering, of maintaining some dignity in a situation that offered none. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the cold that must have been seeping into her bones. It wasn't a plea or an apology, just a straightforward question asked as if she had every right to expect a reasonable answer. Jonas stared at her, literally stared, his mouth not quite open, but his expression clearly conveying something between shock and offense. Nobody asked to join his table. Nobody had asked in 8 years. The very boldness of it, the audacity of this stranger to ignore every social cue, every unspoken rule, every warning his very posture broadcasted, struck him momentarily speechless. "Every other seat is taken," she added when he didn't respond, as if this simple observation should be explanation enough, as if the logistics of seating arrangements trumped the invisible boundaries of a broken man's self-imposed exile. A dozen responses rose in Jonas's throat. "No. Find somewhere else. I don't care if you have to stand in the rain." But as he opened his mouth to deliver whatever cutting dismissal would finally penetrate her incomprehensible determination, something stopped him. It was her eyes. Not pleading, not frightened, not even particularly hopeful. Just steady. She'd asked a question and was waiting for an answer, prepared to accept whatever he decided, but not willing to pretend she hadn't asked. There was something in that steadiness that reminded Jonas of a truth he'd spent 8 years trying to forget, that he'd once been the kind of man who helped people, who protected strangers, who believed in something beyond his own guilt and pain. Against every instinct he'd cultivated, against 8 years of practiced isolation, against the screaming voice in his head that told him this was a mistake, Jonas McCade heard himself say, "Suit yourself." The saloon remained silent, a collective holding of breath, as Eleanor Graves pulled out the chair directly across from him and sat down. She placed her carpet-bag on the floor beside her, folded her hands on the table, and met his eyes with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been simple acknowledgement. Jonas couldn't tell which, and wasn't sure it mattered. Tommy Brennan appeared at the table within seconds, his young face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Ma'am, you're Miss Graves, the new school teacher?" "I am," she confirmed, her voice warmer addressing the bartender than it had been speaking to Jonas, though still touched with the formality of someone not from Montana Territory, someone whose accent placed her origins somewhere back east, somewhere civilized and far from this rough frontier town. "We expected you on tomorrow's stage," Tommy said, stating the obvious because someone needed to fill the silence and the entire saloon was eavesdropping on this conversation. "I took an earlier connection," Eleanor explained, not bothering to elaborate on why someone would choose to arrive a day early only to end up walking through a rainstorm to reach her destination. "I was told there would be a boarding house?" "Mrs. Henderson's place? Yes, ma'am. But it's a good mile from here, and in this weather. I'll manage, Eleanor said with the same steady certainty she'd used to claim her seat at Jonas's table. But first, I'd appreciate something warm to eat, if that's possible. Of course, ma'am. We've got beef stew, cornbread, and coffee hot enough to burn your tongue. Perfect, Eleanor said, and Jonas watched something that might have been the ghost of a smile touch her lips. All three, please. Tommy nodded and hurried away, clearly eager to spread the news of this development to the kitchen and anyone else who might have somehow missed the spectacle of a woman sitting at Jonas McCade's table. Jonas and Eleanor sat in silence as the ambient noise of the saloon gradually resumed, conversations picking up where they'd left off, though the volume remained noticeably lower than before, everyone straining to overhear whatever might transpire at the corner table. Jonas studied the woman across from him with the same careful attention he'd once used to assess potential threats during his martial days. She was shivering now, he noticed, small tremors that she was trying to control but couldn't quite manage. Her hands, still folded on the table, were red from cold, the fingernails slightly blue. She'd been walking in that rain for more than a few minutes, probably the entire mile from where the stage had apparently dropped her off. "You should have waited for tomorrow's coach," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much these days, and when he did, his words came out harder than he intended, like stones that had been sitting too long in cold water. Eleanor's hazel eyes met his without flinching. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I'm here now." It wasn't an answer, not really, but Jonas recognized it as the only one he was going to get. He understood the impulse, the need to move forward, to not wait, to take action even when patience would have been wiser. He'd made that mistake himself, 8 years ago, and it had cost him everything. Tommy returned with a steaming bowl of stew, a plate of cornbread, and a cup of coffee that sent wisps of steam curling into the air. He set them in front of Eleanor with exaggerated care, as if serving royalty rather than a bedraggled schoolteacher. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and this time her smile was real, transforming her face from something merely determined into something approaching beautiful, though Jonas immediately pushed that observation away as irrelevant and unwelcome. She picked up her spoon and began eating, not delicately, but with the focused hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in some time. Jonas watched her for a moment, then forced himself to look away, to stare at his own cold coffee, to pretend her presence at his table was no more remarkable than a change in the weather. But he couldn't stop himself from asking, "Where's your coat?" Eleanor paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth, and for the first time since she'd entered the saloon, Jonas saw something other than certainty in her expression. It was brief, just a flicker, but he recognized it. Embarrassment mixed with something that might have been regret or loss or both. "Left behind," she said simply, and resumed eating. Another non-answer, but this one carried weight. Left behind. Not lost, not forgotten, not stolen. Left behind, deliberately, suggesting a departure that hadn't allowed time for gathering all possessions, suggesting that Eleanor Graves had her own demons chasing her, her own reasons for walking into storms. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now, less hostile and more occupied. The quiet of two people in proximity who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. Eleanor ate steadily, and Jonas found himself watching the rain hammer against the saloon's single window, the glass rattling in its frame with each gust of wind. "You're Jonas McCade," Eleanor said suddenly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Jonas tensed, his jaw tightening. He'd spent 8 years cultivating anonymity, becoming just another face in a small town, the quiet rancher who kept to himself and bothered no one. But of course people talked. Of course his story had spread, warped and exaggerated with each telling, until he wasn't sure anymore which version was truth and which was frontier mythology. "I am," he acknowledged, giving her no more than she'd given him when Tommy had asked if she was the schoolteacher. "I was told you were the man to avoid," Eleanor continued, her tone conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than delivering what amounted to social ostracism. "That you preferred solitude and didn't take kindly to interruption." Jonas felt something hot and sharp twist in his chest, anger, perhaps, or shame at being reduced to such a simple description, even if it was accurate. "And yet here you are," he said, his words edged with frost. And yet, here I am, Eleanor agreed, meeting his eyes again with that infuriating steadiness. But every other seat was taken, and I needed to sit down. So either I could honor your preference for solitude while standing in wet clothes until I caught pneumonia, or I could risk your displeasure for the sake of basic human necessity. I chose the latter. Practical, Jonas said, and it wasn't quite an insult, but certainly wasn't a compliment. I found that practicality serves better than pride in most situations, Eleanor replied, and there was something in her voice, a hardness beneath the cultured accent, that suggested she'd learned that lesson the way Jonas had learned his, through pain and consequence. They fell silent again. Eleanor finished her stew and started on the cornbread, eating with less urgency now, almost thoughtfully. Jonas noticed she held the coffee cup between both hands, absorbing its warmth, her fingers slowly returning to their normal color. "Why Silverdale?" Jonas asked, surprising himself with the question. He didn't care. He had no reason to care, but the words were out before he could stop them, genuine curiosity breaking through 8 years of practiced indifference. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, long enough that Jonas thought she might not answer at all. Then she said, "Because it was far away." "From what?" "Boston, expectations, a life that no longer fit." She said it matter-of-factly, no self-pity or drama, just stating circumstances as they existed. "I wanted to teach, to be useful, to start again somewhere no one knew my history or my failures. The territorial governor was willing to assign me here. So here I am." Jonas understood that impulse more than he wanted to admit. The desire to outrun your past, to find a place remote enough that your mistakes couldn't follow. Except they always did follow, Jonas had learned. They lived inside you, a permanent resident in the spaces where hope used to reside. "Teaching in Silverdale won't be what you're used to," Jonas said, and he couldn't quite keep the warning tone from his voice. "It's rough here. The children are more familiar with mining and ranching than books. Most of them don't speak English as a first language. And the schoolhouse has been abandoned for 5 years. It'll need significant work before it's suitable for anything." "Then I'll do significant work," Eleanor replied with that same unshakable certainty that seemed to be her defining characteristic. "I didn't come to Montana Territory expecting comfort or ease, Mr. McCade. I came expecting challenge. I'm not afraid of difficult work." "You should be," Jonas said quietly. "Difficulty here has a way of breaking people who aren't prepared for it." Eleanor's hazel eyes studied him with sudden intensity, and Jonas had the uncomfortable feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years. "Is that what happened to you?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. "Did this place break you, or did you arrive already broken?" The question struck Jonas like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his hands clench involuntarily on the table. For a moment, just a moment, he wanted to tell her, wanted to explain about the girl, about the standoff, about how everything went wrong in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Wanted to describe how guilt tasted, how it coated your tongue and throat until every word felt contaminated, how it settled into your bones until standing up straight felt like a lie. But 8 years of silence was a habit too strong to break with a stranger, no matter how steady her eyes or how familiar her determination felt. So instead, Jonas pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing attention from the surrounding patrons. "I should go," he said, his voice rough. "You'll be fine here. Tommy will see you get to Mrs. Henderson's when the rain lets up." He stood, reaching for his hat from where it hung on the back of his chair, suddenly desperate to escape, to return to the familiar walls of his ranch, to the silence that didn't ask questions or expect answers. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and there was something in her voice that made Jonas pause despite his urgent need to leave. "For letting me sit, for the conversation, for the warning about difficulties. I appreciate all of it." Jonas looked down at her, this strange woman who'd invaded his sanctuary with nothing more than need and audacity, and found he had no response that made sense. So he simply nodded, a sharp jerk of his head that acknowledged her words without committing to anything beyond that moment. He made it 3 steps toward the door before her voice stopped him again. "Mr. McCade?" He turned, reluctant, already regretting that he'd paused at all. Eleanor was standing now, her wet dress clinging to her frame, her hair still plastered to her face, but her posture was straight, her chin raised, every inch of her broadcasting the same determination that had carried her through a rainstorm to sit at a table where she wasn't wanted. "Whatever broke you," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet saloon, "you should know that broken things can still be useful. Sometimes they're the most useful things of all." The words hit Jonas harder than any accusation or condemnation could have. Not because they offered hope, he'd long ago abandoned hope as a luxury he couldn't afford, but because they suggested she understood. That somehow, this stranger from Boston, with her proper accent and her carpetbag of incomplete belongings, recognized the particular brand of destruction that had turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. Jonas didn't respond. Couldn't respond. He simply turned and walked out into the rain, letting the storm swallow him whole, the cold water on his face indistinguishable from the burning behind his eyes that he refused to acknowledge as tears. Behind him, in the warm glow of the Silver Spur Saloon, Eleanor Graves sat back down at the table where she'd been both uninvited and yet somehow welcomed. She picked up her coffee cup with steady hands and sipped slowly, her hazel eyes fixed on the door through which Jonas McCade had disappeared. "That man is trouble," Tommy Brennan said quietly, appearing at her elbow to refill her cup. "Kind of trouble that can't be fixed, no matter how hard someone might try." Eleanor smiled, small and private, the expression of someone who'd heard similar warnings before and had chosen to ignore them. "I didn't come to Montana Territory to fix anyone," she said. "I came to teach children and start over. If that man prefers solitude, he's certainly entitled to it." But even as she said it, Eleanor was remembering the moment Jonas McCade had looked up from his cold coffee, the storm in his eyes, the weight of whatever guilt he carried visible in every line of his weathered face. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror, on mornings when the past felt more real than the present. She'd come to Silverdale to escape her history, to outrun the scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Boston, to find a place remote enough that the lies told about her couldn't follow. She'd expected isolation, expected to rebuild her life in careful solitude, one small student at a time. She hadn't expected to recognize her own brokenness reflected in a stranger's eyes. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Silverdale clean while accomplishing nothing about the dirt that lived deeper, in hearts and memories, and the spaces where forgiveness should reside but never quite took root. Jonas McCade walked through it without bothering to hurry, letting it soak through his clothes and into his skin. A penance he'd performed 1,000 times before and would perform 1,000 times again. In his ranch house, 3 miles outside town, he would strip off his wet clothes and stand by the dying fire, warming himself slowly, methodically, the way he did everything now. He would not think about hazel eyes or steady voices or the observation that broken things could still be useful. He would not wonder what scandal had driven a Boston schoolteacher to the most remote territory in America, or why her determination felt so familiar it hurt. He would simply exist, as he had for 8 years, one cold night after another, accumulating moments of isolation until they formed years, until they formed a life that looked from the outside like living, but felt from the inside like the longest kind of dying. But somewhere in the darkness, in the space between the rain and the morning, something had shifted. Jonas McCade didn't recognize it yet, didn't understand that Eleanor Graves sitting down at his table without asking permission was the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. All he knew, walking through the storm toward his empty house, was that for the first time in 8 years, he'd had a conversation that felt almost like being alive. And he wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse, couldn't decide if he should be grateful or furious that this stranger had disrupted the careful numbness he'd cultivated. Behind him, Silverdale settled into its stormy night, the saloon warm and bright against the darkness, the new schoolteacher drinking coffee at a corner table that had just become something other than a monument to one man's exile. Tomorrow, Eleanor Graves would begin the work of transforming an abandoned schoolhouse into something that could hold children and learning and hope. Tomorrow, Jonas McCade would return to his routine of isolation and silence, to his corner table and his cold coffee and his practiced indifference. But tonight, for just a few minutes, 2 people running from different paths had shared space and conversation, and the recognition that brokenness came in many forms but always felt the same. It wasn't much. It wasn't redemption or healing or even friendship. But it was something. And in a town as remote and hard as Silverdale, Montana territory, in the autumn of 1878, sometimes something was enough to keep you breathing until morning. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving Silverdale washed clean and gleaming under a sky so blue it looked painted. Jonas woke before dawn, as he always did, his body still operating on the schedule of a lawman who'd learned that trouble came earliest when good men were still sleeping. He lay in his narrow bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling beams he'd counted 1,000 times before, and tried not to think about hazel eyes and the observation that broken things could still be useful. He failed. By the time the sun crested the eastern mountains, Jonas had already fed his horses, repaired a section of fence that didn't really need repairing, and convinced himself that his routine would remain undisturbed, that last night had been an anomaly, a single disruption in the careful pattern of his exile that would fade like the storm itself. He was wrong about that, too. 3 days passed before Jonas returned to the Silver Spur. 3 days during which he told himself he was simply busy with ranch work, that his absence had nothing to do with avoiding a certain school teacher or the uncomfortable feeling her words had stirred in his chest. But on the 4th night, habit proved stronger than avoidance, and he found himself pushing through the saloon doors at his usual time, his eyes automatically seeking his corner table. She was there. Not at his table, but visible through the front window, standing in the street outside the abandoned schoolhouse across the way. Even in the fading light, Jonas could see she was covered in dust, her hair tied back with what looked like a torn piece of cloth, her dress, a different one, brown this time instead of green, streaked with dirt and what might have been paint. "She's been at it since sunrise," Tommy said from behind the bar, following Jonas's gaze. "Every day for 3 days. Won't accept help from anyone. Says she needs to prove she can handle it herself." Jonas grunted, a non-committal sound that could have meant anything or nothing. He moved to his table, noting with something that might have been relief or disappointment that all 3 empty chairs remained exactly that, empty. He sat with his back to the window, ordered his usual coffee and stew, and tried to focus on the familiar routine. He made it almost 10 minutes before curiosity, or something he refused to name, made him turn and look again. Eleanor had climbed onto the schoolhouse roof. She was on her hands and knees examining something near the chimney, her movements careful but determined. As Jonas watched, she reached for a loose shingle, testing its stability, and even from this distance he could see it was rotted through, dangerous, likely to give way under any significant pressure. "Damn fool, woman," he muttered, the words out before he could stop them. "Beg pardon?" Tommy appeared at his elbow with the coffee. "Nothing," Jonas said, but his eyes remained fixed on the figure on the roof. Eleanor shifted her weight, reaching for something in the tool belt she'd fashioned from rope, and Jonas saw the shingle beneath her crack. She noticed it too, pulling back quickly, but the damage was done. The wood splintered with an audible crack that carried across the street, and suddenly she was sliding, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the slick surface. Jonas was moving before conscious thought caught up with action. He knocked his chair backward in his haste, ignoring Tommy's startled exclamation, and was through the saloon doors in 3 long strides. His boots hit the muddy street at a run, years of martial training overriding 8 years of deliberate inertia, his body remembering what it meant to move with purpose toward danger instead of away from everything. "Grab the gutter," he shouted, his voice carrying the command authority he hadn't used since wearing a badge. "Miss Graves, the gutter!" Eleanor's hand shot out, catching the rain gutter just as her feet went out from under her completely. She hung there, suspended, her body dangling 15 feet above the ground, her face pale but focused. No screaming, no panic, just concentrated effort to hold on. Jonas reached the building and positioned himself directly beneath her. "Let go," he called up. "I'll catch you." "The gutter won't hold," Eleanor shouted back, and Jonas could see she was right. The metal was already groaning, pulling away from the rotted fascia board. "I know," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "That's why you need to let go now, while I'm in position. Trust me." For a fraction of a second, Eleanor's eyes met his, and Jonas saw her making the calculation, weighing trust against risk, the word of a stranger against the certainty of a failing handhold. Then the gutter gave another ominous creak, the decision made for her, and she let go. She fell in what felt like slow motion but was probably less than 2 seconds. Jonas caught her solidly, his arms closing around her waist, her momentum driving them both backward into the mud. They went down hard, Jonas taking the brunt of the impact, his back hitting the ground with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Eleanor landed on top of him, her elbow catching him in the ribs, her hair in his face, her weight solid and real and alive. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jonas was acutely aware of several things simultaneously: the mud seeping through his shirt, the ache in his ribs where her elbow had connected, the fact that he was holding another human being for the first time in 8 years, and the way Eleanor's heart was hammering against his chest, rapid as a hummingbird's wings. "Are you hurt?" he managed, his voice rougher than usual from the impact. Eleanor pushed herself up slightly, looking down at him with wide eyes. "No. Are you?" "I've had worse," Jonas said, which was true and also an enormous understatement. He released his hold on her waist and they both struggled to their feet, covered in mud, breathing hard, aware that half of Silverdale was now watching from windows and doorways. Eleanor looked up at the roof, at the broken shingles, and the twisted gutter now hanging at a dangerous angle. "Well," she said with remarkable composure, "I suppose that needed to be replaced anyway." Jonas stared at her, incredulous. "You could have broken your neck." "But I didn't," Eleanor pointed out, brushing ineffectually at the mud on her dress. "Thanks to you. I'm grateful, Mr. McCade. That's twice now you've helped me when you didn't have to." Twice? Jonas's mind was still catching up with what had just happened, with the fact that he'd moved, had acted, had done something other than sit in deliberate isolation. "You let me sit at your table?" Eleanor said simply. "When you could have refused, that was the first time." Jonas had no response to that. He looked at the schoolhouse, at the visible disrepair, at the magnitude of work she was attempting alone. "This building needs more than shingles," he said, his marshal's eye automatically cataloging structural problems. "The foundation's shifted on the north side. There's rot in half the window frames, and that chimney is a death trap waiting to happen." "I know," Eleanor said, and there was something in her voice, pride mixed with frustration, that suggested she'd already discovered all of these problems and more. "But I can fix it. I have books on carpentry, and I'm stronger than I look, and—" "You'll be dead before winter," Jonas interrupted flatly, "either from falling off that roof again or from freezing when you can't get the chimney working safely." Eleanor's chin came up, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. "I didn't ask for your assessment, Mr. McCade, and I certainly didn't ask to be rescued, though I appreciate that you were there, but I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "Clearly," Jonas said dryly, gesturing to the mud covering both of them and the dangerous roof above. They stood there in the street, two mud-covered people glaring at each other while the sun set behind the mountains, and Silverdale watched with undisguised fascination. Jonas felt something stirring in his chest, something that might have been amusement or might have been the rusty gears of human connection trying to turn after years of deliberate disuse. "I'll help you," he heard himself say, the words emerging despite his complete lack of intention to speak them. Eleanor blinked, her anger deflating into confusion. "What?" "With the schoolhouse," Jonas clarified, wondering if the fall had rattled his brain more than he'd thought. "I'll help you fix it, properly, so it's safe for the children." "I don't need charity," Eleanor said stiffly. "Good, because I'm not offering any," Jonas replied. "I'm offering skilled labor in exchange for—" He paused, realizing he hadn't thought this through, had no idea what he actually wanted in exchange or why he was making the offer at all. "In exchange for you not breaking your neck before the school term starts. The territory went to a lot of trouble to send a teacher. Seems wasteful to lose you to preventable stupidity." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Preventable stupidity?" "Climbing on a rotted roof without proper equipment or safety measures," Jonas said. "That's the definition." For a long moment, Eleanor simply studied him, her head tilted slightly, and Jonas had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated, measured against some internal standard he couldn't see. Finally, she said, "Why would you help me? You don't even like people." "I don't like incompetence," Jonas corrected. "And watching you kill yourself through stubbornness would be incompetent on my part, since I have the skills to prevent it." It was a lie. Or at least not the whole truth. But Jonas didn't examine his motivations too closely. He didn't want to acknowledge that something about Eleanor's determination reminded him of who he used to be, or that her observation about broken things being useful had lodged in his mind like a splinter he couldn't extract. "I can't pay you," Eleanor said finally. "The territorial governor provides my salary, but it's minimal, and I need every penny for supplies and—" "Didn't ask for payment," Jonas interrupted. "Said I'd help. Different thing entirely." Eleanor worried her lower lip, a gesture that made her look younger, more vulnerable than her usual steady determination suggested. "People will talk," she said quietly. "A single woman and a single man working together, alone. In Boston, that would be—" "This isn't Boston," Jonas said, his voice harder than he intended. "And I don't give a damn what people say. Never have." That, at least, was absolute truth. Eleanor took a deep breath, seemed to come to some internal decision. "All right," she said. "If you're offering help, I'd be a fool to refuse it. The schoolhouse does need significant work, and I—" She hesitated, and for the first time since Jonas had met her, he saw something like vulnerability cross her face. "I don't actually know anything about carpentry. I have books, but they're not the same as experience." "No," Jonas agreed. "They're not." They stood there another moment, two people covered in mud, reaching an understanding neither of them quite trusted. Then Eleanor extended her hand, formal and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. McCade. I accept your offer of assistance." Jonas looked at her outstretched hand, at the mud on her fingers and the strength in her grip, and after a brief hesitation, he took it. Her handshake was firm, no nonsense, the grip of someone who meant what she said. "Jonas," he said gruffly, "if we're going to work together, might as well use first names." "Eleanor," she replied, and that ghost of a smile touched her lips again. "Though I warn you, I'm told I'm a difficult person to work with." "Can't be worse than working alone," Jonas said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. They released hands and stood there awkwardly, the sun now fully set, the street lamps beginning to glow along Silverdale's main thoroughfare. Jonas became aware that they were still the center of attention, that half the town was probably already composing stories about what they'd witnessed. "You should get cleaned up," he said finally. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, early. We'll assess what actually needs doing before you climb on anything else." Eleanor nodded. "Tomorrow then, early." Jonas turned to go, then paused. "Miss Graves, Eleanor, that was brave what you did. Stupid, but brave. Most people wouldn't have tried to fix the roof themselves." "Most people haven't needed to prove they can handle difficulty," Eleanor replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested layers of meaning Jonas didn't fully understand. "Good night, Jonas." "Good night." Jonas walked back to the silver spur, acutely aware of the eyes following him, the whispers starting before he was even out of earshot. He ignored them, as he'd ignored everything for 8 years, but this time the isolation felt different, less like armor and more like habit, something he wore because he'd forgotten how to take it off, rather than because he actually needed it. Tommy had saved his dinner, though the coffee had gone cold. Jonas ate mechanically, his mind replaying the moment of catching Eleanor, the solid weight of another person in his arms, the fierce determination in her eyes as she'd hung from that gutter. She was going to be trouble, he realized. Not the dangerous kind. He had dealt with enough of that as a marshal to recognize the difference, but the kind that disrupted carefully maintained equilibrium, that asked questions with no good answers, that made you remember you were alive whether you wanted to or not. He should walk away, should go back to his ranch and his solitude and let Eleanor Graves figure out the schoolhouse on her own or find someone else to help her. There were other men in Silverdale with carpentry skills, men without Jonas's history, without the weight of guilt that made every human connection feel like a betrayal of the girl whose life he'd ended. But even as he thought it, Jonas knew he wouldn't walk away. Something about catching Eleanor, about her falling and trusting him to be there, had awakened something he'd thought long dead. Not hope. He was too realistic for that, but maybe possibility. The possibility that broken things could still be useful, that 8 years of penance didn't have to become a lifetime sentence, that maybe, just maybe, helping someone else might not be the betrayal of the dead he'd always believed it to be. It was a dangerous thought. Jonas pushed it away and finished his stew. The next morning arrived cold and clear, frost coating the ground in a white blanket that crunched under Jonas's boots as he walked toward the schoolhouse. He'd brought his tools, a decision made at 3 in the morning when sleep proved impossible, and carried them in the same worn leather bag he'd used back when building things had been a source of satisfaction rather than a mechanical necessity. Eleanor was already there, standing in front of the schoolhouse with her hands on her hips, surveying the building like a general assessing a battlefield. She'd cleaned up from yesterday's mud bath and wore a simple gray dress with an apron over it, her auburn hair braided and pinned in a practical style that suggested she was ready for work. "You're early," Jonas observed, stopping a few feet away, maintaining careful distance. "I don't sleep much," Eleanor admitted. "Too many thoughts. You're early, too." "Same reason," Jonas said, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, that insomnia was another thing they shared, another marker of people running from pasts that chased them, even in darkness. Jonas set down his tool bag and walked slowly around the building, his trained eye cataloging problems. The list grew longer with each step. "This is worse than I thought," he said finally. "The foundation needs shoring up. The roof needs complete replacement, not just repair. Half the windows need to be rebuilt from scratch, and the chimney, He paused, looking up at the crooked stack of bricks. "The chimney needs to come down and be reconstructed entirely. It's a miracle the whole thing hasn't collapsed." Eleanor's face fell slightly, but she straightened her shoulders. "How long will all that take?" Jonas did quick calculations in his head. "Working alone? 3 months minimum, probably 4. "School starts in 6 weeks, Eleanor said quietly. "Then we'd better get started," Jonas replied. "And we'll need help. I can do most of it, but not all. And not fast enough for your timeline." "I told you I can't pay—" "Not talking about paid help," Jonas interrupted. "Talking about community help. This town needs a school, needs their children educated. They'll pitch in if asked properly." Eleanor looked doubtful. "I'm a stranger here. Why would they help me?" Jonas met her eyes. "Because I'll ask them," he said simply. "And because seeing the schoolhouse rebuilt will matter to them more than whatever reservations they might have about the new teacher from Boston." "You do that?" Eleanor asked, and there was something in her voice, surprise mixed with what might have been gratitude or hope. "Ask on my behalf?" "Said I'd help," Jonas replied gruffly. "That includes more than just carpentry." They stood there in the cold morning air, breath misting between them, and Jonas felt the weight of commitment settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He was doing this, actually doing this, involving himself in community affairs, in another person's problems, in life beyond his carefully maintained isolation. It terrified him. It also felt right in a way nothing had felt right in 8 years. "Where do we start?" Eleanor asked. Jonas looked at the building, at the magnitude of work ahead, and felt something that might have been the distant cousin of purpose stirring in his chest. "Foundation," he said. "Always start with the foundation. Everything else is worthless if the base isn't solid." They worked through the morning in companionable silence, Jonas showing Eleanor how to assess structural damage, explaining what could be salvaged and what needed complete replacement. She asked intelligent questions, took mental notes, and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty when he needed her to hold a board steady or help move debris. By noon, they'd cleared the interior of broken furniture and accumulated debris from 5 years of abandonment. Jonas was surprised by how easily they worked together, how Eleanor anticipated what he needed before he asked, how she didn't flinch from heavy lifting or uncomfortable positions. She was stronger than she looked, her determination translating into physical resilience. "You've done manual labor before," Jonas observed as they took a break, sitting on the schoolhouse steps sharing the lunch Eleanor had brought. "My father was a carpenter," Eleanor said, her voice carefully neutral. "Before he became a merchant. I used to help him when I was young, before—" She trailed off, and Jonas didn't push. They ate in silence for a while, the autumn sun warm on their faces despite the chill in the air. Jonas found himself studying Eleanor's profile, the way she looked at the schoolhouse with such fierce determination, as if renovating this building was somehow connected to renovating herself. "What happened in Boston?" he asked, the question emerging before his internal censor could stop it. What made you leave? Eleanor was quiet for so long Jonas thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, I was a teacher there too, at a private academy for wealthy children. I loved it. The teaching, the students, the feeling of making a difference. She paused, her hands gripping the sandwich she'd stopped eating. There was a man, she continued finally, her voice flat. A senator's son. He decided he wanted me as his wife. I declined. He didn't accept that answer gracefully. When I continued to refuse his advances, he fabricated a scandal, spread rumors that I'd behaved inappropriately with male students. It wasn't true. None of it was true. But it didn't matter. His word against mine, a senator's son against a teacher with no family connections. I was dismissed. My reputation was destroyed. No school in Boston would hire me. No school anywhere in the East would hire me. Jonas felt anger building in his chest, hot and sharp. So you ran. So I escaped, Eleanor corrected, her chin lifting. I took the only position offered to me, this one, in a place so remote that Boston's scandal couldn't follow. I'm here because I refused to let one man's lies define my entire life. That's why you had to prove you could handle the schoolhouse alone, Jonas said, understanding clicking into place. Why you won't ask for help? If I can't manage this, Eleanor said, her voice tight with emotion she was clearly fighting to contain. If I fail here, then he wins. Then every lie he told becomes truth. I have to succeed, Jonas, not just for the students, but for myself, to prove I'm more than what he tried to make me. Jonas understood that need more than Eleanor could possibly know, the need to prove something, to atone for something, to reconstruct yourself from the ruins of whatever had destroyed who you used to be. You asking for help isn't weakness, he said quietly. It's practical. You said so yourself. Practicality serves better than pride. Eleanor turned to look at him, and Jonas saw tears shining in her eyes that she refused to let fall. Why are you being kind to me? She asked. Everyone says you hate people, that you want nothing to do with anyone. Yet here you are helping me, asking me questions, treating me like what? Jonas asked when she didn't finish. Like I matter, Eleanor whispered. Like my story matters. Like I'm worth more than my worst moment. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow, because they described exactly what Eleanor was doing for him too, whether she realized it or not. Treating him like he was worth more than his worst moment, like the guilt that defined him wasn't all he was. Maybe we both need to remember that, Jonas said finally, that we're worth more than our worst moments, that broken things can still be useful. Eleanor smiled then, genuine and warm, and Jonas felt something crack in the wall around his heart. Not break, it was too soon, and he was too damaged for that, but definitely crack, letting in a sliver of light he hadn't realized he'd been missing. That night, true to his word, Jonas went to church. He hadn't been inside the small white building since his first month in Silverdale 8 years ago, when guilt and grief were still fresh enough that he'd tried prayer as a potential solution. It hadn't worked. God, if he existed at all, seemed to have no interest in Jonas McCade's redemption, so Jonas had stopped trying. But Eleanor had mentioned attending Sunday service, had casually referenced it in conversation that afternoon, and Jonas found himself thinking that if she could walk into Silverdale alone and face down scandal and climb on dangerous roofs and trust him to catch her, then he could sit through one church service. The congregation noticed him immediately, whispers spreading through the pews like wildfire as Jonas entered and took a seat in the very last row, as far from other people as possible while still technically participating. He kept his eyes forward, ignoring the stairs, focusing on the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. Eleanor arrived moments later, and Jonas watched from the corner of his eye as she chose a seat near the middle, her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. She must have felt the same whispers Jonas had, the curiosity and speculation that came with being new and single and female in a small frontier town, but she gave no sign of discomfort. Reverend Walsh, a kind man in his 60s who'd tried repeatedly to reach Jonas over the years, looked genuinely shocked to see him in attendance. To his credit, he didn't make a spectacle of it, just offered a small nod of acknowledgement before beginning the service. Jonas didn't listen to the sermon. He'd stopped believing that words about forgiveness and grace applied to men like him, Men who'd killed innocent children, men whose mistakes were too large for any god to overlook. But he sat through it anyway, because he'd told Eleanor he'd help, and somehow that included being seen with her in public, showing the town that the school teacher had at least one person willing to stand with her. After the service, Eleanor found him outside where he was preparing to leave quickly, before anyone could attempt conversation. "You came," she said, and her smile was surprised and pleased. "Said I'd help," Jonas replied, his standard answer to everything, apparently. "This goes beyond fixing a schoolhouse, Jonas," Eleanor said gently. "You know that, right? Coming to church, being seen publicly supporting me, that's friendship." The word hung between them, terrifying and impossible. Jonas hadn't had a friend in 8 years, didn't deserve friends, didn't know how to be one anymore. "It's practical," he said finally, echoing her own words from days before. "Town needs to see you belong here, that you have support. Makes everything easier." Eleanor studied him with those knowing hazel eyes. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked softly. "That everything you do is practical? That kindness is just strategy?" Jonas had no answer that wouldn't require admitting things he wasn't ready to face, so he simply tipped his hat and walked away, feeling her eyes on his back and hearing his own lie echo in his mind. Because nothing about Eleanor Graves was practical. Not the way she made him talk, or remember who he used to be, or consider that maybe 8 years was long enough to carry guilt alone. She was dangerous and disruptive and entirely impractical. And Jonas was beginning to realize he was in serious trouble. The weeks that followed established a rhythm Jonas hadn't known he was capable of anymore. Every morning, just after dawn, he would arrive at the schoolhouse with his tools and find Eleanor already there, often with fresh coffee brewing on a small portable stove she'd acquired from somewhere. They would work through the morning, their conversations gradually shifting from pure practicality to something more personal, though neither acknowledged the change directly. True to his word, Jonas had recruited help from the town. It turned out that mentioning the schoolhouse needed work was enough. The men of Silverdale showed up on Saturday with their own tools, their own expertise, and a collective determination to see their children educated. They asked no payment, expected no thanks beyond Eleanor's genuine gratitude, which she offered freely. Jonas found himself working alongside men he'd successfully avoided for years. Samuel Morton, the blacksmith, who could shape metal for the new roof flashing. Peter Chen, who ran the general store and had connections for ordering supplies at reduced cost. Even young Tommy Brennan from the saloon appeared, eager to learn carpentry and clearly harboring a boyish crush on the pretty schoolteacher that made Jonas feel something uncomfortably close to jealousy, though he refused to examine that feeling too closely. But it was the quiet moments, when the other men had gone home, and it was just Jonas and Eleanor working in the fading light, that Jonas found himself both anticipating and dreading. Those were the times when conversation drifted beyond hammers and nails, when the walls he'd built around himself felt thinnest, most vulnerable to breach. It was during one of those evenings, 3 weeks into the renovation, that Eleanor asked the question Jonas had been waiting for and hoping to avoid. They were in the schoolhouse attic, a cramped space under the new roof where Jonas was installing support beams while Eleanor held the lantern and handed him tools. The work was hot, dusty, and intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with proximity and shared purpose. "Why did you leave the marshal's badge behind?" Eleanor asked, her voice cutting through the sound of Jonas's hammer against wood. Jonas's hand froze mid-swing. He'd known this was coming, had felt her circling the question for days like someone approaching a wounded animal, uncertain whether it would flee or attack. He finished driving the nail, bought himself a few seconds, then sat back on his heels. "That's not a simple story," he said finally. "I didn't expect it would be," Eleanor replied. Her face in the lantern light was patient, open, without judgment or demand. "But I told you my worst moment. Seems only fair you tell me yours." Jonas felt the weight of 8 years pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe in the already stifling attic air. He could refuse, could climb down that ladder and walk away, and she wouldn't stop him, wouldn't push. But somehow, in this cramped space with dust motes dancing in lantern light and Eleanor's steady presence beside him, the words that had been locked inside him for so long began to emerge. "I was a deputy marshal in Wyoming Territory. he started, his voice rough. Good at it too. Fast draw, faster thinking, the kind of lawman who could talk down most situations before they turned violent. I believed in the badge, in justice, in protecting innocent people from those who'd do them harm. He paused, staring at the hammer in his hands, as if it might offer answers to questions he'd stopped asking. There was a robbery, he continued. Bank in a small town called Redemption, ironic name considering. 3 men, heavily armed, took hostages. Standard procedure was to wait them out, negotiate, find a peaceful solution. But the territorial marshal, my superior, he had political ambitions, wanted to make a name for himself with a dramatic rescue. Eleanor shifted slightly, the lantern creating new shadows across Jonas's face, but she said nothing, just listened. He ordered us to go in, Jonas said, and even after 8 years his voice carried the bitterness of that moment. I argued, said we needed more time, that forcing a confrontation would get people killed. He overruled me. Direct order. So we went in. Jonas closed his eyes, but that only made the memories sharper, more vivid. He could still smell the gunpowder, still hear the screaming. Everything went wrong, he said flatly. They heard us coming, started shooting. We returned fire. It was chaos, smoke, noise, people running in every direction. I saw movement behind a counter, saw what I thought was one of the robbers taking aim. I fired. Clean shot, center mass, exactly like I'd been trained. His voice broke on the last word. Eleanor's hand found his shoulder, steady and warm, anchoring him to the present even as the past threatened to pull him under. It wasn't a robber, Jonas whispered. It was a girl. 14 years old, daughter of the bank manager. She'd been hiding, was standing up to run. I killed her instantly. 1 bullet, perfect accuracy, absolutely wrong target. The attic was silent except for Jonas's ragged breathing. He'd never said those words aloud before, had never allowed himself to describe what happened in detail. The guilt he carried was abstract, a weight without specific shape. Giving it words made it real in a way that threatened to destroy what little equilibrium he'd managed to build. Her name was Sarah, he continued, because having started, he found he couldn't stop. Sarah Mitchell. She wanted to be a teacher, like you. Her mother told me that at the funeral, probably thinking it would comfort me somehow, knowing her daughter had dreams. It didn't. It made everything worse. Jonas? Eleanor said softly, her hand still on his shoulder. There was an inquest, Jonas pushed forward, needing to finish, to purge all of it. They ruled it a justified shooting, said I'd acted appropriately under the circumstances. The territorial marshal praised my quick response. They wanted to promote me, said I'd acted with courage under fire. Courage. He laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. I turned in my badge that day, he said. Walked away from everything. Came here to Montana Territory, bought a small ranch, and tried to disappear. Tried to become so small, so invisible, that maybe God would forget what I'd done. That maybe I could forget. But you never did, Eleanor said, not a question. No, Jonas agreed. Every day, every night, I see her face. The surprise in her eyes, the way she fell. I took a girl's entire future in the space between one heartbeat and the next. How do you come back from that? How do you allow yourself to be happy, to live, to care about anything when you've destroyed someone else's chance at all of those things? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Jonas waited for the inevitable platitudes, the empty reassurances that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have known, that accidents happen in war and law enforcement and life. He'd heard them all before, from the inquest board, from well-meaning townspeople who'd learned his story, from the reverend who'd tried to offer spiritual counsel. But Eleanor didn't offer platitudes. You can't come back from it, she said finally, and her honesty was like cold water, shocking and clarifying. What you did can't be undone. That girl's death, your responsibility for it, those are facts that no amount of penance or isolation will change. Jonas felt something crack inside him, something he'd been holding together through sheer force of will, because she was right. He'd known she was right, but hearing someone else say it, someone who didn't try to soften the truth or make him feel better, somehow made it bearable. But, Eleanor continued, her voice steady, You can't honor Sarah's memory by refusing to live. You can't give her back the future she lost by throwing away your own. That's not justice, Jonas. That's just waste compounding tragedy. How can I deserve to be happy when she'll never have that chance? Jonas asked, and his voice was raw with 8 years of accumulated pain. You can't, Eleanor said simply. You don't deserve it. None of us deserve happiness or peace or love. Those aren't rewards for good behavior. They're gifts, Jonas. Grace is given, not earned, and refusing the gift doesn't honor anyone, not Sarah, not the people who care about you, not even yourself. Jonas turned to look at her then, really look at her, and saw tears streaming down her face that she made no effort to wipe away. She was crying for him, for Sarah, for all the ways guilt and shame could trap people in prisons of their own making. I don't know how to forgive myself, he whispered. Maybe you don't have to, Eleanor said. Maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Maybe the point is learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. Learning to live with guilt while still living. Honoring Sarah's memory by doing good with the time you have left. By being the kind of man who helps school teachers fix buildings and comes to church and catches people when they fall. Something shifted in Jonas at those words. Some fundamental rearrangement of the landscape of his grief. The guilt didn't disappear. He suspected it never would. But for the first time in 8 years, it felt like something he might be able to carry while still moving forward instead of remaining frozen in that terrible moment. How did you get so wise? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor laughed, a sound caught between tears and something that might have been joy. I'm not wise, she said. I'm just another broken person trying to figure out how to keep breathing. But I've learned that we broken people need to help each other because nobody else understands what it's like to be shattered and still expected to function. Jonas reached up and covered her hand with his, the one still resting on his shoulder, and they sat there in the dusty attic with lantern light flickering around them and 8 years of isolation beginning to crack under the weight of connection. Thank you, he said finally, for listening, for not telling me it wasn't my fault. It was your fault, Eleanor said, because she was nothing if not honest. But it was also an accident, a terrible mistake made in terrible circumstances. Both things can be true. You can be guilty and still be worthy of compassion, even your own. They climbed down from the attic eventually, finishing their work for the evening, but something had changed between them. The foundation they'd been building wasn't just for the schoolhouse anymore. It was for something neither of them had expected and both of them desperately needed. Friendship built on honesty, connection forged in shared brokenness, the tentative possibility that maybe neither of them had to carry their burdens alone anymore. The next day was Sunday, and Jonas arrived at Eleanor's boarding house to walk her to church. It was a bold gesture in a small town where such things were noticed and remarked upon, but Jonas found he no longer cared about protecting his isolation. Eleanor had cracked his armor, had seen the worst of him and hadn't fled, and that felt more valuable than any amount of protective solitude. Mrs. Henderson answered the door with raised eyebrows and a knowing smile. Mr. McCade, she said, her tone suggesting she'd been expecting this development. Miss Graves will be right down. Jonas waited in the boarding house parlor, hat in his hands, feeling absurdly like a schoolboy calling on a girl for the first time. When Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a dark blue dress he hadn't seen before, and with her auburn hair arranged in soft waves around her face, Jonas felt his breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with carpentry or friendship or practical support. She was beautiful, not in the delicate, fragile way that needed protection, but in the strong, determined way of someone who'd survived storms and emerged still capable of warmth. Her hazel eyes met his, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, of the intimacy of what they'd shared last night, the vulnerability of truth-telling. Ready? She asked, descending the stairs with natural grace. As I'll ever be, Jonas replied, offering his arm in a gesture that felt both archaic and entirely appropriate. Eleanor took it, her hand light on his elbow, and they walked through Silverdale's morning streets toward the white church that stood on the hill overlooking town. Jonas was acutely aware of the eyes that followed them, the whispers that started before they'd even left Mrs. Henderson's property. The quiet cowboy who'd eaten alone for 8 years was now publicly escorting the new schoolteacher, and Silverdale's gossip mill was undoubtedly working overtime to assign meaning to that fact. Let them talk, Jonas thought. Let them speculate. He'd spent 8 years caring too much about what people might think, about whether he deserved to participate in normal human activities. Eleanor's words from last night echoed in his mind, that happiness was a gift, not a reward, and refusing it honored no one. The church was fuller than usual, probably because word had spread that Jonas McCade was attending services, and half the town wanted to witness this improbable sight. Jonas and Eleanor took seats near the middle this time, not hiding in the back, not apologizing for their presence. If the congregation wanted to stare, Jonas decided, he'd give them something to look at. Reverend Walsh's sermon was about restoration and rebuilding, and Jonas suspected the timing wasn't coincidental. The Reverend had undoubtedly heard about the schoolhouse renovation, about Jonas's involvement, about the subtle shift happening in Silverdale's most notorious recluse. His words were carefully chosen, speaking of how broken things could be made whole, how communities were strengthened through collective effort, how grace operated in unexpected ways. Jonas found himself actually listening this time, found meaning in words he'd dismissed as empty platitudes for years. Maybe the words hadn't changed. Maybe he had. After the service, Eleanor was immediately surrounded by townspeople wanting to introduce themselves properly, to welcome her to Silverdale, to express their excitement about the school reopening. Jonas stood slightly behind her, watching how she handled the attention with genuine warmth and gracious appreciation, never condescending despite her Boston education, never suggesting that she was somehow superior to these frontier people who were offering her acceptance. "You're good for her," Reverend Walsh said quietly, appearing at Jonas's elbow. "And I suspect she's good for you." Jonas turned to face the minister, expecting judgment or warning, but found only kindness in the older man's eyes. "I'm not sure good is the word I'd use," Jonas said carefully. "Disruptive, maybe. Unsettling." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Walsh replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes we need to be unsettled from the comfortable patterns we've established, even when those patterns are slowly killing us." Jonas had no response to that uncomfortably accurate observation. He simply nodded, accepting the truth of it. "The town is glad to have you back, Jonas," Walsh continued. "Not the badge or the reputation, but you. The man who helps rebuild schools and walks friends to church. That's the person we want in our community." "I don't know if that person still exists," Jonas admitted. "He's standing right here," Walsh said gently. "He's been here all along, just buried under guilt that was never his alone to carry. The marshal who gave that order, the robbers who created the situation, the randomness of where people stood at the wrong moment, those all contributed to what happened. You pulled the trigger, yes, but you didn't load that gun alone." It was the same argument Jonas had heard at the inquest, but somehow, hearing it now, after last night's conversation with Eleanor, after weeks of working alongside her and remembering what purpose felt like, the words landed differently. Not as absolution, Jonas wasn't ready for that, and suspected he never would be, but as a more balanced distribution of responsibility. Eleanor extricated herself from the crowd and rejoined Jonas, her cheeks slightly flushed from the attention, her eyes bright with something that looked like happiness. "They've invited us to the autumn social next week," she said. "Apparently it's a town tradition, and everyone thinks we should attend." "Us?" Jonas asked, emphasizing the plural. "Well, me specifically," Eleanor admitted, "but I told them I'd only come if you'd escort me. I hope that was presumptuous." Jonas felt something warm unfold in his chest, something that might have been pleasure or might have been terror at how quickly his careful isolation was crumbling. "That was presumptuous," he agreed, "but accurate. I'll escort you." Eleanor's smile could have lit the entire territory. "Excellent. I should warn you, though, Mrs. Henderson says there's dancing involved. I hope you know how to waltz." Jonas hadn't danced in over a decade, not since before his marshal days, when he'd been a different person in what felt like a different lifetime. "I'm rusty," he said carefully. "Very rusty." "Good," Eleanor said with mock seriousness. "That makes two of us. We can be terrible together and blame each other when we step on people's feet." They walked back through town, their conversation light but companionable, and Jonas realized with something approaching alarm that this felt dangerously close to courting. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, when helping Eleanor fix the schoolhouse had transformed into walking her to church and agreeing to attend social functions, when friendship had started, including the awareness of how the sunlight caught in her hair, or how her laugh made something in his chest feel less constricted. This was dangerous territory. Jonas had no business thinking of Eleanor as anything other than someone he was helping, someone who'd disrupted his isolation, but who would eventually move on with her life, her teaching, her rebuilding of self. He was still fundamentally broken, still carrying guilt that no amount of carpentry or church attendance could fully absolve. He had nothing to offer someone like Eleanor beyond his skills with a hammer and his willingness to catch her when she fell. But even as he thought it, Jonas knew he was lying to himself. Something was growing between them, something tender and terrifying, and despite every logical reason to retreat back into isolation, Jonas found he didn't want to. For the first time in 8 years, he wanted to move towards something instead of away from everything. That afternoon, Jonas brought Eleanor to his ranch for the first time. He'd mentioned it in passing during their work on the schoolhouse, and she'd expressed interest in seeing it, in understanding the life he'd built in exile. Jonas found himself both nervous and oddly proud as they approached the property, wondering what she would see when she looked at the place that had been his hermitage for so long. The ranch was small but well-maintained, the house simple but sturdy, built by Jonas's own hands in those first years when physical labor had been the only thing that kept him from drowning in guilt. The barn was neat, his 2 horses well cared for, the fence lines straight and true. It was a testament to competence, if not ambition, the home of a man who'd forgotten how to dream but still remembered how to survive. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, and she sounded like she meant it. "Peaceful. I can see why you chose it." "I chose it because it was remote," Jonas said honestly. "Because I could go days without seeing another person. Because it let me hide." "And now?" Eleanor asked, turning to face him. "Are you still hiding?" Jonas considered the question, looking around at the property he'd built as a fortress against human connection. "I'm trying not to," he admitted. "Some days are easier than others." Eleanor walked toward the meadow that stretched behind the house, and Jonas followed, watching as she took in the expanse of grass and wildflowers, the creek that ran along the southern boundary, the mountains rising in the distance like sentinels. He'd spent 8 years looking at this view without really seeing it, without appreciating the beauty, because beauty felt like something he'd forfeited the right to enjoy. "This could be magnificent," Eleanor said, her voice full of possibility. "You could expand the house, add a porch overlooking the meadow, plant more wildflowers in the spring, maybe get some cattle, actually ranch instead of just maintaining." "Why would I do that?" Jonas asked, genuinely curious about her vision. Eleanor turned to him, and her expression was so open, so full of hope and determination, and something that might have been affection, that Jonas felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling like the rotted roof on the schoolhouse. "Because you're not just surviving anymore, Jonas," she said softly. "You're starting to live again. And living requires building, not just maintaining. It requires hope for a future, not just endurance of the present." But Jonas wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons why hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, why building implied belief in tomorrow when he'd spent 8 years convinced he didn't deserve tomorrows. But standing there in his meadow, with Eleanor painting visions of possibility, Jonas found he couldn't quite summon the arguments. They felt hollow, like walls he'd built out of habit rather than necessity. "I don't know how to hope," he said instead, offering her honesty since that seemed to be the only currency that mattered between them. "Then let me hope for you," Eleanor replied, "until you remember how." They stood there in the autumn sunlight, 2 broken people contemplating a future that neither of them had expected to want, and Jonas felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not healing, that would take more time than he could fathom, but perhaps the beginning of willingness to heal. The first tentative step toward believing that broken things, including himself, might still be useful for something beyond penance. The week passed in a blur of work and conversation and careful proximity. The schoolhouse renovation progressed faster than Jonas had anticipated, the collective effort of Silverdale's men transforming the abandoned building into something that actually resembled a place of learning. Eleanor threw herself into preparing lessons, ordering books and supplies, creating a curriculum that would serve children of varying ages and abilities. Jonas found himself spending more time in town than at his ranch, found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse even when no work needed doing, found excuses to walk Eleanor back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in the evenings. They talked about everything and nothing, her experiences teaching in Boston, his memories of marshal work before everything went wrong, her plans for the students, his half-forgotten dreams of what life might have been if he'd made different choices. And through it all, Jonas felt himself slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to care. Not just about the schoolhouse or the abstract concept of helping someone, but about Eleanor specifically. About her laugh and her determination and the way she saw potential in things other people had written off as hopeless. About the way she never let him retreat into comfortable isolation, never accepted his practiced deflections, never treated him like someone who needed to be handled carefully, lest he break. It was terrifying because Jonas knew how easily care transformed into loss, how quickly connection could be severed by violence or accident or the fundamental unfairness of a universe that took 14-year-old girls and left guilty marshals breathing. But it was also intoxicating, this feeling of being tethered to someone, of mattering to another person beyond what practical services he could provide. The night of the autumn social arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if Montana itself was encouraging Silverdale to celebrate. Jonas dressed carefully in clothes he'd purchased years ago, but never worn. Dark trousers and a white shirt that Eleanor had helped him select from Peter Chen's general store. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Not the guilty marshal or the isolated rancher, but someone in between, someone tentatively emerging into a life that might include more than survival. Eleanor was radiant when he collected her from the boarding house, wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves that brought out the gold in her hazel eyes. Mrs. Henderson fussed over them both like a proud mother, straightening Jonas's collar and adjusting Eleanor's shawl, clearly delighted by this development in her boarder's social life. The social was held in the town hall, which had been decorated with bunting and lanterns. The simple space transformed into something approaching festive. Tables laden with food lined one wall, musicians tuned their instruments on a small platform, and it seemed like every resident of Silverdale had turned out for the event. Jonas and Eleanor's entrance together drew immediate attention, conversations pausing as people took in the sight of the notorious recluse escorting the new schoolteacher. But the attention felt different than Jonas expected, less judgmental and more pleased, as if the town had been collectively holding its breath, waiting for Jonas to rejoin the living. "I think they're happy to see you here," Eleanor murmured, her hand light on Jonas's arm. "They're happy to see you," Jonas corrected. "I'm just the unfortunate escort." "Liar," Eleanor said with a smile. "You're the man who helped rebuild their school. They love you for that, whether you believe it or not." The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Jonas found himself in conversations he would have avoided for years, accepting congratulations on the schoolhouse renovation, discussing plans for the students' education, even laughing at Peter Chen's terrible jokes about his inventory shortages. Eleanor was in her element, gracious and warm with everyone who approached, but always returning to Jonas's side, making it clear without words that she'd chosen him, that his presence mattered to her. When the music started and dancing began, Jonas felt his carefully cultivated ease evaporating into nervousness. He hadn't danced in over a decade, wasn't sure he remembered how, wasn't certain he deserved to participate in something as joyful and frivolous as dancing when Sarah Mitchell would never dance again. Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation. She took his hand and led him to the edge of the dance floor, not quite joining the other couples, but not hiding in the shadows either. "We don't have to dance if you're not ready," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "We can just stand here and watch, or leave entirely if it's too much." Jonas looked at her, at the understanding in her eyes, at the way she offered him options without judgment or pressure. And he realized that he wanted to dance, wanted to hold Eleanor in his arms to music and movement, wanted to participate in life instead of just observing it from the margins. "I'm ready," he said, surprised to find it was true. "Though I warn you, I meant it about being rusty." Eleanor's smile was brilliant as Jonas led her properly onto the dance floor. He placed one hand at her waist, took her other hand in his, and as the music began, a simple waltz, thank God, he started to move. The first few steps were awkward, Jonas's body remembering movements his mind had tried to forget. But Eleanor was patient, following his lead even when it faltered, laughing softly when he stepped on her foot, and apologizing like it was her fault instead of his. And then, gradually, muscle memory took over. Jonas found the rhythm, found the pattern, found that his body still knew how to do this even if his heart had forgotten. They moved together across the floor, not gracefully, but with increasing confidence, and Jonas felt something long dormant awakening in his chest. Joy. Tentative and fragile, but unmistakably joy. He pulled Eleanor slightly closer, close enough to smell the lavender she wore, close enough to feel her breath on his neck when she laughed at something he said. Around them, other couples danced, the room full of music and warmth and life, and for the first time in 8 years, Jonas allowed himself to be part of it, instead of standing outside looking in. "Thank you," he said quietly as the song ended and another began. "For what?" Eleanor asked, not moving from his arms. "For sitting down without asking," Jonas said. "For not accepting my refusal. For seeing something in me worth saving." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You were always worth saving, Jonas. You just needed someone stubborn enough to prove it." They danced through 3 more songs before Jonas needed air, needed space to process the overwhelming rush of feeling that came from allowing himself connection. They stepped outside into the cool night air, standing close together on the town hall steps, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "This is dangerous," Jonas said finally, voicing the fear that had been building all evening. "What is?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "This," Jonas gestured between them. "Us. Whatever this is becoming, I can't offer you what you deserve, Eleanor. I'm still broken, still guilty, still carrying weight that's never going to disappear. You should be with someone whole, someone who can give you a future without shadows." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I don't want someone whole," she said firmly. "Whole people don't understand what it's like to be shattered. They offer pity instead of compassion, advice instead of presence. They can't sit with you in the dark because they've never had to navigate it themselves." "That doesn't mean I'm the right choice," Jonas argued, even as part of him desperately wanted her to disagree. "Maybe you're not," Eleanor agreed, and Jonas felt his heart sink until she continued. "Maybe we'll both discover this is a terrible mistake. Maybe being broken together isn't enough. But Jonas, I'd rather risk being wrong with you than settle for being safe with someone who doesn't understand me. Life already took my reputation, my career, my home. I refuse to let it take my chance at real connection, too." Jonas stared at her, this remarkable woman who'd invaded his isolation and refused to accept his carefully constructed excuses. She was right. They were both broken, both carrying pasts that couldn't be undone. But maybe that was exactly why this might work. Why 2 people who understood darkness might be able to find light together. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to care about someone again. How to let someone care about me." "Then we'll figure it out together," Eleanor said. "One day at a time. One conversation, one dance, one shared meal. We don't have to have everything figured out tonight." Jonas reached up and touched her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her soft skin. "You terrify me," he said honestly. "Good," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "You terrify me too. Let's be terrified together." And there, on the steps of Silverdale's town hall, with music and laughter floating out from inside and stars emerging overhead, Jonas McCade made a choice. Not to forget his past or absolve his guilt or pretend Sarah Mitchell's death didn't matter, but to honor her memory by living, by caring, by allowing himself to be broken and useful and maybe, eventually, something approaching whole again. He kissed Eleanor then, soft and questioning, a first kiss that tasted like possibility and fear, and 8 years of isolation finally cracking under the weight of hope. She kissed him back, her arms coming around his neck, and Jonas felt his carefully constructed walls finally, completely crumbling. They were both broken, both carrying shadows, both terrified of what came next. But they were broken together, and somehow that made all the difference. The kiss changed everything and nothing. When Jonas and Eleanor finally pulled apart, the music still played inside the town hall, The stars still hung overhead, and Silverdale remained exactly as it had been moments before. But the landscape between them had fundamentally shifted, transformed from careful friendship into something neither could pretend to misunderstand. They stood on those steps in silence for a long moment, Jonas's forehead resting against Eleanor's, both of them breathing like they'd run a great distance. Jonas felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability and everything to do with having finally allowed someone past the walls he'd built from guilt and grief. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive he'd felt since pulling that trigger 8 years ago. "We should go back inside," Eleanor said finally, though she made no move to step away. "People will notice we're gone." "Let them notice," Jonas replied, echoing her words from weeks ago. "I'm done hiding." Eleanor smiled, and even in the dim light from the hall's windows, Jonas could see it was the kind of smile that transformed her entire face, made her beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with joy. That's a dangerous declaration from a man who's spent 8 years perfecting the art of invisibility. "I'm finding I have a taste for danger lately," Jonas said, and was surprised by the truth of it. Everything about Eleanor was dangerous to his carefully maintained isolation. Her questions, her honesty, her refusal to let him retreat into comfortable numbness. But instead of making him want to run, as he would have even a month ago, it made him want to lean in, to see what else existed beyond the narrow confines of survival he'd been inhabiting. They did return to the social eventually, though Jonas kept Eleanor's hand in his, a public declaration that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. If anyone found their absence remarkable, they were too polite to mention it directly, though Jonas caught knowing looks from Mrs. Henderson and an approving nod from Reverend Walsh. The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur of conversation and occasional dancing, Jonas allowing himself to participate in community life with a freedom he hadn't known he was capable of anymore. When he finally walked Eleanor back to the boarding house, the late autumn air had turned cold, promising frost by morning. Jonas draped his jacket over Eleanor's shoulders without asking, and she accepted it without protest, pulling it close around herself. They walked slowly, neither in a hurry to end the evening, their footsteps echoing on Silverdale's quiet streets. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked as they approached Mrs. Henderson's front porch. Jonas understood she wasn't asking about logistics or schedules. She was asking about them, about what came after acknowledging that friendship had evolved into something more complicated and more precious. It was a fair question, and Jonas wished he had a better answer than the uncertainty that roiled in his chest. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never done this before. Not like this. Not while carrying everything I'm carrying." "Neither have I," Eleanor said. "My experience with courtship ended rather spectacularly in scandal and exile. I'm not exactly an expert in how relationships are supposed to progress." Jonas found himself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. "So we're both making this up as we go?" "Apparently," Eleanor agreed, "though I think we should establish some basic parameters. I like you, Jonas. More than I expected to, more than is probably wise given how recently we met, but I need you to understand something." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious in the lamplight. "I didn't come to Montana Territory looking for romance or rescue," she continued. "I came to rebuild my life, to prove I'm more than the scandal that destroyed my reputation. The school, the teaching, my independence, those things matter to me. I won't give them up, won't make myself smaller, won't pretend to need saving just to make a man feel useful." "I wouldn't ask you to," Jonas said, and meant it. "Your strength is what drew me to you in the first place." "Well, that and your complete inability to take no for an answer." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm in the cold air. "Then we understand each other. I want whatever this is between us, Jonas, but not at the cost of losing myself. I did that once, tried to make myself acceptable to someone else's expectations. It nearly destroyed me." "I understand," Jonas said, and he did. He'd spent 8 years destroying himself through isolation, knew intimately how trying to be someone you weren't, or refusing to be someone you could be, corroded the soul from the inside. "I don't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are. That's the person I'm falling for." The words were out before Jonas could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying in their implications. falling for. Not fallen, not yet completely, but moving in that direction with increasing velocity, unable or unwilling to stop the momentum. Eleanor's breath caught, visible in the cold air. Falling for, she repeated softly. That's a dangerous admission, Jonas McCade. Everything about you is dangerous, Jonas replied, but I'm learning that some risks are worth taking. They kissed again on Mrs. Henderson's porch, slower this time, less desperate and more deliberate. Jonas poured 8 years of isolation into that kiss, all the loneliness and guilt and desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this one good thing. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisted in his shirt, and Jonas felt the last of his resistance crumbling like the schoolhouse's rotted roof. When they finally separated, Eleanor was shivering from cold despite Jonas's jacket. He made her go inside, waiting until he heard the door lock before walking back through Silverdale's empty streets toward where he'd left his horse. The ride back to his ranch felt different than usual, the familiar path transformed by the knowledge that he was no longer quite as alone as he'd been that morning. The next week passed in a haze of work and stolen moments. The schoolhouse was nearly complete, just finishing touches remaining before Eleanor could begin teaching. Jonas found himself inventing reasons to be there, to help with tasks that didn't really require his expertise, just to be near Eleanor as she transformed the space into something that reflected her vision of what education could be. They were careful in public, aware that Silverdale was watching their developing relationship with interest that bordered on investment. Small touches when passing tools, conversations that lasted longer than strictly necessary, the way Jonas's eyes followed Eleanor across rooms, all of it noticed, remarked upon, generally approved of by a town that seemed collectively pleased to see their resident ghost rejoining the living. But in private moments, when the other volunteers had gone home and it was just the two of them in the schoolhouse with late afternoon sun slanting through newly installed windows, they allowed themselves more freedom. Conversations that ranged from practical matters to philosophical debates to shared stories from their respective pasts. Kisses stolen in the storage room or on the front steps. The gradual, terrifying process of letting someone truly know you. It was during one of these moments, a week after the autumn social, that Eleanor brought up something that had clearly been weighing on her mind. I received a letter today, she said, her voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Jonas on alert. From Boston. Jonas set down the book he'd been shelving and turned to face her fully. From the senator's son? His father, Eleanor clarified. The senator himself. It seems he's concerned about his son's reputation, about rumors that might damage the family's political prospects. He's offering me money to sign a statement saying nothing inappropriate happened between his son and myself, that I left Boston of my own volition for reasons unrelated to his family. Jonas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. In other words, he wants you to publicly absolve his son while accepting blame for the scandal. Essentially, yes, Eleanor said, though he's framing it as a generous offer to help me establish myself in my new position. The money would be substantial, Jonas, enough to fully supply the school, to buy everything the children need, to ensure I'm financially secure for years. Jonas studied her face, trying to read what she was feeling beyond the careful neutrality of her expression. What are you going to do? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in her hands as if it might contain different words if she looked hard enough. Part of me wants to take it, she admitted. Not for myself, but for the students. I could do so much good with that money. Buy books I could never otherwise afford, proper desks, teaching materials, everything that would give these children the education they deserve. But, Jonas prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But it would be a lie, Eleanor said, her voice suddenly fierce. It would be saying that what he did was acceptable, that powerful men can destroy women's reputations without consequence as long as they pay enough to bury the truth afterward. It would be making myself complicit in his crime against me. Jonas moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel his presence, his support. You already know what you're going to do, he said gently. You just want permission to do it. Eleanor looked up at him, and Jonas saw tears shining in her eyes that she refused to let fall. I'm going to refuse, she said. I'm going to write back and tell the senator that his son is a liar and a manipulator, that I will not absolve him, and that he can take his blood money and choke on it. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Jonas felt pride swelling in his chest. This was the Eleanor he'd come to know and care for. Strong, principled, unwilling to compromise her integrity even when the cost was high. "That's going to make your life harder," he observed. "The senator has power, connections. He could make trouble for you even out here." "Let him try," Eleanor said with steel in her voice. "I've already lost everything once. I survived it. I can survive whatever consequences come from telling the truth." Jonas reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You won't have to survive it alone," he said. "Whatever trouble comes, whatever the senator tries to do, you'll have me. You'll have Silverdale. We take care of our own here." Eleanor's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so tired of being strong," she whispered. "So tired of fighting. Sometimes I just want to accept the easy option, even if it means compromising everything I believe in." "I know," Jonas said, pulling her into his arms. "I spent 8 years taking the easy option, hiding, isolating, refusing to engage with life. It felt safer than risking connection. But Eleanor, easy isn't the same as right. And you've already proven you're not someone who takes the easy path when principle is at stake." Eleanor cried against his chest, and Jonas held her, understanding intimately the exhaustion of carrying burdens that never seemed to get lighter. They stood there in the empty schoolhouse as afternoon faded into evening, two people supporting each other through the kind of moral crisis that had no perfect answers, only the choice between integrity and convenience. When Eleanor finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but her expression was resolved. "Will you help me write the response?" she asked. "I want to make sure I say exactly what needs saying, nothing more or less." "Of course," Jonas said. They spent the next hour crafting Eleanor's response to the senator, Jonas offering suggestions while Eleanor did the actual writing. The letter was masterful in its restraint. It stated facts without embellishment, refused the offer without unnecessary insult, and made clear that Eleanor would not be intimidated or bought. When they finished, Eleanor sealed it with wax and set it aside to be posted in the morning. "Thank you," she said to Jonas, "for helping, for understanding, for not trying to convince me to take the money, even though it would have benefited the students. The students will benefit more from having a teacher who models integrity than from having fancy books bought with blood money," Jonas replied. "You're teaching them something more valuable than reading and arithmetic. You're showing them what it looks like to stand up for yourself, to refuse to be defined by other people's lies." Eleanor smiled, though exhaustion shadowed her features. "When did you become so wise?" "When I started listening to a stubborn schoolteacher who wouldn't take no for an answer," Jonas said. "You've taught me more in the past few weeks than I've learned in 8 years of isolation." They locked up the schoolhouse and Jonas walked Eleanor back to Mrs. Henderson's, as had become their evening ritual. At the boarding house door, Eleanor hesitated before going inside. "Jonas," she said carefully, "would you consider coming to the school on opening day? Not to help with anything, just to be there. I think I'd feel braver knowing you were in the room." Jonas understood what she was really asking, not just for his presence, but for visible support, for a public declaration that he stood with her against whatever storms might come. It was a bigger commitment than helping renovate a building or walking someone to church. It was choosing sides, making himself a target for whatever retaliation the senator might attempt, tying his reputation to hers in a way that couldn't easily be undone. "I'll be there," he said without hesitation. "Front row, if you'll have me." Eleanor's relief was visible. "Thank you. I know it's asking a lot. It's asking me to be brave enough to stand with you," Jonas interrupted. "That's not too much. That's the bare minimum of what you deserve." The school opened on a crisp November morning, frost still glittering on the grass when Jonas arrived early to find Eleanor already there, nervously arranging desks for the 7th time. She'd barely slept, he could tell, but her eyes were bright with determination and excitement in equal measure. "How many students are registered?" Jonas asked, hanging his hat on a peg near the door. 17, Eleanor said, straightening a slate that was already perfectly straight. "Ages 6 to 14. 3 different primary languages. Varying levels of prior education. It's going to be chaos." "It's going to be wonderful," Jonas corrected. "You're going to be wonderful." Eleanor turned to face him, and Jonas saw naked fear beneath her professional composure. "What if I'm not good enough? What if they don't listen, or their parents decide I'm too scandalous to teach their children, or I can't handle the age range, or... Jonas crossed the room and took her hands. Eleanor, breathe. You're the most competent, determined, brilliant person I've ever met. These children are lucky to have you. Stop borrowing trouble from a future that hasn't happened yet. When did you become so calm? Eleanor asked, a slight smile breaking through her anxiety. When I realized that watching you succeed matters more to me than my own fear, Jonas said honestly. You've got this. I know you do. And I'll be right here, reminding you of that truth every time you forget. The students began arriving shortly after, a stream of children of varying ages and sizes, some eager and others clearly dragged by determined parents. Jonas took his promised seat in the front row, feeling absurdly large in a chair meant for a child, but unwilling to break his word about where he'd be. Eleanor transformed before his eyes. The nervous woman rearranging desks disappeared, replaced by a confident educator who greeted each student by name, who somehow knew which child needed gentle encouragement and which needed firm direction, who managed to create order from chaos with nothing more than presence and patience. Jonas watched her work with something approaching awe. This was Eleanor in her element, doing what she was meant to do, and it was magnificent. She moved between students with practiced ease, adjusting a younger child's grip on a slate pencil, challenging an older boy who seemed bored with work that was too easy, mediating a dispute over a shared book with fairness that left both parties satisfied. The parents who'd come to observe, initially skeptical of the Boston schoolteacher with the rumored scandal, gradually relaxed as they watched Eleanor interact with their children. Jonas could practically see their reservations melting away, replaced by cautious approval and then genuine appreciation. By lunchtime, when parents departed and students broke for the meal they'd brought, Silverdale's school was officially, successfully reopened. Eleanor collapsed into a chair at her desk, looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. That was terrifying, she announced to Jonas, who'd remained in his increasingly uncomfortable chair throughout the morning. That was brilliant, Jonas corrected. You're a natural, Eleanor. Those children already love you. Little Mary Chen tried to eat paste, Eleanor said, and Jacob Morrison asked me 14 questions about whether fish can think, and the Schwartz twins spoke nothing but German the entire time, which I don't speak, so I have no idea if they understood anything I said. And you handled all of it perfectly, Jonas said. Little Mary now knows paste isn't food. Jacob got interested enough in philosophy to forget about being troublesome, and the Schwartz twins were following along fine. I speak some German. They understood everything and were commenting on how pretty you are. Eleanor's face flushed slightly. You speak German? Picked it up working in Wyoming, Jonas said with a shrug. Lots of German immigrants mining there. Thought it might be useful. Can you teach me? Eleanor asked. Basic phrases, at least. Enough to communicate with the twins and their parents. If you want, Jonas said, though I'm not much of a teacher. Neither was I until this morning, apparently, Eleanor replied with a tired smile. We'll figure it out together. That seems to be our approach to most things. The afternoon session went even more smoothly than the morning, Eleanor's confidence building as she settled into the rhythm of managing multiple ages and ability levels simultaneously. Jonas finally extracted himself from the child-sized chair and spent the afternoon doing small repairs around the building, staying busy but available if Eleanor needed anything. When the last student departed and Eleanor locked the schoolhouse door, she looked both exhausted and triumphant. I did it, she said, almost to herself. I actually did it, my first day teaching in Silverdale, and nobody died or quit or burned down the building. Setting the bar pretty low there, Jonas observed with amusement. After this morning's anxiety, I was prepared for all three of those outcomes, Eleanor admitted. The fact that it went well feels almost miraculous. They walked through Silverdale as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Eleanor talking animatedly about her students, about lesson plans she was already adjusting, about challenges she'd identified and strategies for addressing them. Jonas listened, content to let her process the day aloud, offering occasional observations but mostly just appreciating the joy in her voice. At Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Eleanor paused before going inside. Thank you for being there today, she said seriously. I know sitting in a chair meant for a 6-year-old all morning couldn't have been comfortable. I've endured worse for less worthy causes, Jonas replied. Besides, watching you teach was worth any amount of physical discomfort. You're extraordinary, Eleanor. I hope you know that. Eleanor's expression softened into something Jonas was learning to recognize. Affection mixed with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real, that this connection between them was genuine. You're pretty extraordinary yourself, she said. The children kept asking who you were, why you were there. I told them you were a friend who helped build their school. Several of them want to know if you'll come back and tell them stories about being a marshal. Jonas felt something complicated twist in his chest. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Eleanor asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. You have experiences these children will never have. Lessons about justice and consequences and how to handle difficult situations. That's valuable knowledge. It's also knowledge built on blood and guilt, Jonas said quietly. I'm not sure I'm the right person to be teaching children anything. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. You know what I think? She said finally. I think you're still punishing yourself by refusing to share the good parts of who you were. Yes, something terrible happened. Yes, you carry responsibility for it, but that doesn't erase 8 years of honorable service, of protecting people, of doing difficult work with integrity. Those children could benefit from hearing your stories, Jonas, and maybe you could benefit from remembering that you were more than your worst moment. It was the same argument Eleanor had been making in various forms since that first night she sat at his table, this insistence that his guilt didn't define the totality of who he was. Jonas still struggled to believe it, but he was learning to at least consider the possibility. I'll think about it, he said, which was more than he would have offered even a week ago. That's all I ask, Eleanor replied. She kissed him briefly, a soft press of lips that felt like both greeting and goodbye, then disappeared into the boarding house, leaving Jonas standing on the porch with his thoughts and the growing realization that his life was transforming in ways he'd never anticipated and couldn't quite control. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Eleanor taught 5 days a week, pouring herself into her students with a passion that Jonas found both inspiring and slightly concerning. She had a tendency to work herself to exhaustion, staying up late grading slates and preparing lessons, forgetting to eat when she was focused on curriculum development. Jonas made it his unofficial responsibility to ensure she took care of herself, bringing her lunch when she forgot, insisting she stop working at a reasonable hour, offering to help with tasks that didn't require her specific expertise. In return, Eleanor continued her campaign to reintegrate Jonas into community life. She convinced him to join her at church socials, to accept dinner invitations from students' families, to participate in town meetings about Silverdale's future development. Each event felt like stepping further from his comfortable isolation, exposing himself to connection and all the vulnerability that entailed. But Eleanor was always beside him, her presence making it easier to take each progressive step towards something resembling normal human existence. November turned to December, and with it came the first serious snow. Jonas helped Eleanor prepare the schoolhouse for winter, ensuring the newly rebuilt chimney would keep students warm, checking window seals against drafts, stacking firewood high enough to last through the coldest months. The work felt different now than it had during the initial renovation, less about proving competence and more about protecting something precious, ensuring Eleanor's dream could survive the harsh Montana winter. It was during one of these preparation days, while Jonas was on the roof checking for ice damage, and Eleanor was inside inventorying supplies, that trouble arrived in the form of a well-dressed stranger asking questions. Jonas noticed him first, a man in an expensive suit entirely unsuited for Silverdale's rough terrain, speaking with Peter Chen outside the general store. Something about the stranger's bearing, the way he took notes, the intentional casualness of his questions, set off alarms honed during Jonas's martial years. This was someone gathering information, building a case, preparing an attack. Jonas climbed down from the roof and made his way to the general store, arriving in time to hear the stranger ask, "And this school teacher, Miss Graves, she lives alone? No family, no close attachments?" "She boards at Mrs. Henderson's place," Peter said carefully, his tone suggesting he recognized trouble when he saw it. "Why are you asking?" The stranger smiled, a practiced expression that held no warmth. I'm conducting research for a series on frontier education. Want to ensure our facts are accurate. Miss Graves came from Boston, correct? Under somewhat controversial circumstances? Jonas felt anger rising in his chest. This was the senator's retaliation, he was certain. Send someone to dig up dirt, to confirm the scandal, to make Eleanor's life difficult enough that she'd reconsider accepting the offered money in silence. Miss Graves's circumstances are her own business, Jonas said, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to break up bar fights and intimidate outlaws. And I suggest you move along, friend. Silverdale doesn't take kindly to outsiders spreading gossip about our schoolteacher. The stranger turned, his expression shifting from practiced friendliness to calculation as he assessed Jonas. And you are? Someone who's asking you to leave, Jonas said flatly. Now. I'm a journalist, the stranger protested. I have every right to conduct interviews, to gather information. You're a hired gun, Jonas interrupted, his voice cold. Not the shooting kind, but the type that destroys reputations with carefully chosen words. I know your kind. Worked with plenty of them during my martial days. And I'm telling you politely that you need to get on your horse and ride out of Silverdale. Today. The stranger's eyes widened slightly. You're Jonas McCade, the deputy marshal who killed that girl in Wyoming. Now I remember the case. Interesting company Miss Graves is keeping, considering her own scandals. Jonas felt rage threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained control, but years of law enforcement had taught him that violence, even justified violence, only created more problems. You have until sundown, he said quietly, the kind of quiet that carried more threat than shouting. After that, I stopped being polite about asking. The stranger must have heard something in Jonas's tone that suggested he meant every word, because he nodded curtly and walked toward where his horse was tied. Jonas watched until he mounted and rode out of town, then turned to find half of Silverdale's Main Street population watching the confrontation with varying degrees of approval and concern. Someone should warn Miss Graves, Peter Chen said quietly. She should know they're coming after her. I'll tell her, Jonas said, already moving toward the schoolhouse. He found Eleanor still inside, happily arranging new books that had arrived in last week's supply shipment. She looked up when Jonas entered, her smile fading immediately when she saw his expression. What's wrong? She asked. Jonas told her about the stranger, about the questions, about the clear intention to revive the scandal and make her position in Silverdale untenable. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively paler, but her posture remaining straight, determined. So it begins, she said when Jonas finished. The senator is making good on his implied threat. If I won't accept his money in silence, he'll destroy my reputation thoroughly enough that no school anywhere will employ me. We won't let that happen, Jonas said firmly. Silverdale knows you now. They've seen you teach, seen your dedication to their children. Whatever this journalist writes, whatever lies he tells, we'll stand with you. Eleanor smiled, but it was sad, tired. You don't know how these things work, Jonas. Truth doesn't matter when powerful people decide to destroy someone. The senator has connections, resources, the ability to place stories in newspapers across the country. He can make me untouchable, ensure I never teach again anywhere. Then we fight, Jonas said, together. We tell our truth louder than he tells his lies. That only works if people want to believe our truth, Eleanor replied. And history suggests they don't. Not when scandal is more interesting. Jonas crossed the room and took her hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. I spent 8 years letting guilt and shame define me, he said, letting one terrible moment erase everything else I'd been and done. You taught me that broken things can still be useful, that I'm more than my worst act. Now I'm telling you the same thing. You're more than this scandal. You're a brilliant teacher, a courageous woman, someone who chose principle over comfort and honesty over convenience. That's who Silverdale sees when they look at you. That's who I see. And we're not going to let some hired journalist take that away. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I'm so tired of fighting, Jonas. So tired of having to prove I'm worthy of basic respect. I know, Jonas said gently. But you don't have to fight alone anymore. You've got me. You've got this town. We'll face whatever comes together. That night, Jonas did something he hadn't done in 8 years. He went to every home in Silverdale with a student enrolled in Eleanor's school. At each door, He told the parents about the stranger, about the expected attack on Eleanor's reputation, about the importance of standing together to protect their teacher. He laid out the facts as Eleanor had told them to him: the false accusation, the senator's vindictive son, the choice Eleanor had made to refuse blood money rather than compromise her integrity. And at each door, without exception, Silverdale's parents listened and promised their support. Whatever the journalist wrote, whatever stories appeared in distant newspapers, Silverdale would stand with Miss Graves. She was their teacher now, and they protected their own. By the time Jonas returned to his ranch, well past midnight, and exhausted from hours of conversation and explanation, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not in himself, but in his community, in the fundamental decency of people who judged others by their actions rather than their accusations, who valued integrity over scandal. He fell asleep thinking about Eleanor, about her courage in the face of systematic destruction of her reputation, about how someone so strong could still be so fragile when it came to believing she deserved protection. He thought about how far he'd come from the isolated man who ate alone every night, how Eleanor's stubborn refusal to accept his rejection had transformed not just his life but his understanding of what life could be. And he thought about the future, about the possibility that two broken people might actually be able to build something lasting from their shared fragments, might prove that redemption wasn't earned but chosen, that grace operated in ways too mysterious for guilt-ridden marshals and scandal-plagued teachers to fully understand. The fight wasn't over. The senator's attacks would likely intensify before they stopped. But for the first time since Sarah Mitchell's death, Jonas felt ready to fight for something beyond mere survival. He was ready to fight for Eleanor, for their students, for the life they were tentatively building together. He was ready to believe that broken things, when carefully tended and courageously defended, could become something stronger than they'd ever been whole. The article appeared in newspapers across 3 territories within a week, just as Eleanor had predicted. Jonas first learned about it when Peter Chen quietly showed him a copy that had arrived with the supply shipment from Denver. The headline was calculated to inflame: "Disgraced Boston teacher brings scandal to frontier school. Questions arise about moral fitness to educate children." Jonas read it standing in the general store, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. The journalist had been thorough, if not truthful. He'd tracked down the senator's son, who told a convincing story of inappropriate behavior and unwanted advances. He'd found former colleagues from Eleanor's Boston school who, when pressed, admitted there had been rumors and concerns, conveniently forgetting to mention those rumors, had originated with the senator's political allies. The article painted Eleanor as a woman of questionable morals who'd fled east after her behavior made her unemployable, now inflicting herself on unsuspecting frontier families. "It's poison," Peter said quietly. Every word chosen to destroy her while maintaining plausible deniability. This is the work of someone who knows exactly how to weaponize reputation. Jonas folded the newspaper carefully, his hands steady despite the fury coursing through him. "How many copies came in?" "A dozen," Peter admitted. "I've kept them behind the counter. Haven't displayed them. But Jonas, people are going to find out. Someone will get a copy from another town, or the territorial governor's office will send an inquiry, or we get ahead of it," Jonas interrupted. "We tell our story first, our way, before people can read this garbage and form opinions." "How?" Peter asked. Jonas was already moving toward the door. "Town meeting, tonight. Everyone who'll come. And we tell them the truth." By sunset, Silverdale's town hall was packed beyond capacity, people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. Jonas had spent the afternoon spreading word, and the turnout suggested that everyone understood something significant was happening. Eleanor sat in the front row, her face pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap with white-knuckled intensity. Jonas stood at the front of the room, the newspaper in his hand, feeling more nervous than he'd been in any standoff during his marshal years. This was different. He wasn't facing criminals with guns, but an entire community whose opinion would determine Eleanor's future. His future. Their future together. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I know it's unusual to call a town meeting on short notice, but circumstances require it. An article was published this week in several newspapers, making serious allegations about Miss Graves, your children's teacher. I'm sure many of you will read it or hear about it soon, if you haven't already. Before that happens, before you form opinions based on one man's carefully constructed lies, I want you to hear the truth. He held up the newspaper so everyone could see the headline. A murmur ran through the crowd, concerned and curious in equal measure. This article claims that Miss Graves is a woman of questionable morals who was forced to leave Boston under scandal, Jonas continued. It quotes sources who claim she behaved inappropriately with students, that she fled rather than face consequences. It's written by a journalist hired by a powerful senator to destroy Miss Graves's reputation because she refused to lie for him. Jonas paused, making eye contact with parents throughout the room. The truth is this: Eleanor Graves was an excellent teacher at a prestigious Boston academy. A senator's son decided he wanted her as his wife. She refused his advances. When she continued to refuse, he fabricated a scandal, spread rumors of inappropriate behavior that never happened. Rather than fight a battle she couldn't win against a politically connected family, Miss Graves came here, to Montana Territory, to start over, to teach children who deserved education as much as any Boston student. "How do we know your version is true?" someone called from the back. Jonas recognized the voice. Martin Hoffman, a German immigrant whose twin boys were in Eleanor's class. "No disrespect intended, but you have feelings for the teacher. How do we know you're being objective?" It was a fair question, and Jonas appreciated the directness. "You don't," he admitted. "You can't know for certain that my version is true any more than you can verify the newspaper's claims. What you can verify is Miss Graves's behavior since she arrived in Silverdale. You've watched her teach your children for 6 weeks. You've seen her dedication, her skill, her genuine care for each student. You've seen her refuse to compromise her principles, even when offered significant money to do so. Those are facts you can verify with your own eyes, your own experience." Eleanor stood then, her movement drawing every eye in the room. "Mr. McCade is right that you can't verify my past with certainty," she said, her voice clear despite the visible trembling in her hands. "But I can tell you what happened, and you can decide whether my character as you've witnessed it aligns with the woman I'm describing or the woman portrayed in that article." She took a deep breath, and Jonas saw her gathering courage the way she had before climbing onto that dangerous roof months ago. "I was accused falsely by a man who couldn't accept rejection. It destroyed my career, my reputation, my home. I came to Silverdale because I believed in the value of teaching, because I refused to let one man's lies define my entire life. Since arriving here, I've tried to prove through my actions who I actually am, a teacher who cares deeply about students, a woman of principle who won't compromise integrity for convenience." She gestured to the newspaper Jonas still held. "That article is designed to make you doubt me, to make you fear for your children's safety, to pressure you into dismissing me. And I understand if some of you are swayed by it. Reputation matters, and mine has been systematically destroyed by people with more power and resources than I'll ever have. But before you decide, I ask that you consider this. Everything that article accuses me of being, immoral, manipulative, dangerous to children, have you seen any evidence of that in my actual behavior? Or have you seen a woman who loves teaching, who treats your children with respect and kindness, who works harder than necessary because she believes education matters?" The room was silent for a long moment. Then Sarah Chen, Peter's wife, stood up. "I've watched Miss Graves with my daughter Mary," she said in accented English. "Mary is shy, struggles with reading. Miss Graves stays after school 2 days a week, no extra pay, just to help Mary catch up. She is patient, kind. This does not sound like woman in that newspaper." Samuel Morton, the blacksmith, stood next. "My boy Jacob, he's smart but bored easy, always causing trouble in school before it closed 5 years ago. Miss Graves figured out he needed harder work, gives him special assignments that challenge him. He comes home excited about learning. I don't care what some Boston newspaper says. I know what I see with my own eyes." One by one, parents stood and shared their experiences with Eleanor. The Hoffman twins, who spoke only German and now were learning English because Eleanor had convinced Jonas to teach her enough to communicate with them. The older students who'd been preparing to leave school for work, but now talked about continuing education because Eleanor made them believe they were capable. The youngest children who'd never been taught to read and were now sounding out words, proud of their progress. By the time the last parent finished speaking, Eleanor was crying openly, overwhelmed by the community's vocal support. Jonas felt his own throat tight with emotion, pride mixing with relief in his chest. "I propose we write our own response," Reverend Walsh said, standing to address the crowd. "Not just defending Miss Graves, but telling the truth about what she's accomplished here. We send it to the same newspapers that published that attack piece. Let them print both sides and let readers decide." "I'll write it," Jonas heard himself say. "I know how these things work, how to frame a narrative, and I'll sign it, along with anyone else willing to put their name to the truth." The response was immediate and unanimous. Every parent in the room volunteered to sign. Many offered to contribute their own testimonials. What began as a defensive town meeting transformed into something else entirely, a community rallying around one of their own, refusing to let distant powers dictate local truth. The meeting finally disbanded near midnight, plans made and responsibilities assigned. Jonas would write the response. Reverend Walsh would coordinate testimonials. Peter Chen would handle distribution to newspapers. Silverdale was going to war, in its own quiet way, against the senator's campaign of destruction. When everyone had finally left, Jonas and Eleanor remained in the empty town hall. She was still crying, but differently now, not from fear or shame, but from the overwhelming realization that she wasn't alone, that she'd found a community willing to fight for her. "I can't believe they did that," she whispered. "Every single parent stood up for me, even the ones I thought were skeptical." "They stood up for the truth," Jonas said, pulling her into his arms, "and for their children's teacher. You've earned their trust, Eleanor, not through politics or manipulation, but through showing them who you actually are." Eleanor buried her face against his chest, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. "What if the response doesn't work? What if the senator has more resources, more influence, more ability to spread his lies?" "Then we keep fighting," Jonas said simply, "and we keep telling the truth. Eventually, truth has a way of winning, even against power. It just takes longer and costs more than it should." They stood there in the quiet hall, holding each other as the last lanterns burned low. Two people who'd found each other through brokenness, now facing down the forces that had tried to break them. Jonas felt something crystallize in his chest, a certainty that had been building for weeks, but which he'd been too cautious to name. He loved Eleanor Graves, completely, irrevocably, in a way that both terrified him and made him feel more alive than he had since pulling that trigger 8 years ago. She'd invaded his isolation, refused his rejection, seen his worst and decided he was worth knowing anyway. She'd taught him that broken things could be useful, that guilt didn't have to be a life sentence, that maybe, just maybe, he deserved happiness even though he'd taken someone else's chance at it. "Eleanor," he said quietly, pulling back enough to see her face, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes red from crying but still steady, still strong. "What is it?" Jonas took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to step off a cliff with no certainty of what lay below. "I love you," he said, the words both simple and impossibly complex. "I know it's too soon. I know we're in the middle of fighting your battles. I know I have no right to burden you with my feelings when you're dealing with everything else. But I need you to know, you've transformed my life in ways I didn't think were possible. You've made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond survival. You've given me a reason to live instead of just existing. I love you, and whatever comes next, whether we win this fight or not, I want to face it with you." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, and Jonas's heart hammered against his ribs, terrified he'd miscalculated, that his declaration would be too much too soon, that he'd finally found something worth having only to lose it through poor timing. Then Eleanor smiled, radiant despite her tear-streaked face. "You foolish, wonderful man," she said, her voice catching on emotion. "I've been in love with you since you caught me falling off that roof. Maybe even since that first night when you let me sit at your table despite every instinct telling you to refuse. You're brave and kind and so much stronger than you give yourself credit for. Of course I love you. How could I not?" Jonas felt something break open in his chest. 8 years of accumulated ice cracking under the warmth of being loved, of being chosen, despite his guilt and his history and all the reasons he didn't deserve it. He kissed Eleanor then, pouring everything he couldn't articulate into that kiss, gratitude and wonder, and the terrifying hope that maybe they could actually build a life together, that maybe two broken people could create something whole. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling despite everything, Jonas knew what he wanted to do. What he needed to do, regardless of timing or circumstances, or the practical voice in his head suggesting he should wait until Eleanor's situation was resolved. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. "Where?" Eleanor asked, but she followed without resistance as Jonas led her out of the town hall and through Silverdale's dark streets. They walked in comfortable silence to the small white church on the hill, the building that had witnessed Jonas's first tentative steps back toward community, toward connection, toward believing he might be more than his worst moment. The door was unlocked, as it always was, and Jonas led Eleanor inside. The interior was dark except for moonlight streaming through the windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. Jonas led Eleanor to the front pew, where they sat side by side in the quiet sanctuary. "I want to tell you about Sarah Mitchell," Jonas said quietly. "Not just what happened, but who she was, what I took from the world when I fired that shot." Eleanor's hand found his, squeezing gently. She said nothing, just listened, and Jonas felt grateful for her silence, for her willingness to sit with his pain rather than trying to fix it. "She was 14, Jonas began, staring at the simple wooden cross above the altar. "Loved mathematics and poetry," her mother said. "Wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help other children learn. She had red hair and freckles and a laugh that her father said could light up entire rooms. She was beloved, Eleanor, by her parents, her friends, her community. She was a good kid with a bright future, and I ended all of that in less than a second." He paused, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling over him. But this time it felt different, less crushing, and more like something he could carry while still moving forward. "For 8 years I've tried to honor her memory through isolation," Jonas continued, "through making myself smaller, less present, as if taking up less space in the world could somehow balance the space she should have occupied. But you taught me that's not honor. That's just waste compounding tragedy." Jonas turned to face Eleanor fully, memorizing her face in the moonlight. "I can't bring Sarah back. Can't undo what I did or restore what was taken from her family. But I can choose to live in a way that honors her potential, that creates meaning from meaninglessness. I can help other children learn by supporting their teacher. I can be honest and brave and present, the way she never got the chance to be. I can love you and build a life and maybe, eventually, have children who get all the chances Sarah should have had." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but she was smiling. "Jonas?" "I'm not asking yet," Jonas interrupted gently. "Not until we've resolved the senator's attacks. Not until you're certain about your future here. But I need you to know my intentions. When this is over, when you're safe and settled, I'm going to ask you to marry me. I'm going to ask you to build a life with me, here in Silverdale or wherever you want to go. I'm going to ask you to believe that two broken people can create something beautiful together." Eleanor laughed and cried simultaneously, the sound echoing in the empty church. "You're impossible," she said. "Completely impossible. Who tells someone they're going to propose eventually without actually proposing?" "Someone who wants you to have time to think about it," Jonas replied. "Someone who knows you deserve better than a rushed proposal in the middle of a crisis. Someone who loves you enough to let you choose freely, without pressure or urgency." Eleanor shook her head, still smiling despite her tears. "You're giving me too much credit. I don't need time to think about it, Jonas. I already know my answer. Whenever you ask, whether it's tomorrow or a year from now, the answer is yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you. Yes, I believe we can create something beautiful from our brokenness." Jonas felt his own tears finally falling, 8 years of accumulated pain and guilt cracking under the weight of being loved so completely, so unconditionally. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Neither of us deserves this," Eleanor replied, echoing her words from months ago. "But we're going to take it anyway. We're going to choose happiness despite our pasts, despite people who want to destroy us, despite every logical reason to be cautious. We're going to be brave and foolish and so deeply in love that our story becomes the kind that people tell to remind themselves that redemption is possible." They sat there in the quiet church until dawn began to lighten the sky, talking about futures and possibilities, and how to build a life when you're starting with fragments instead of foundations. When they finally emerged into the cold December morning, Jonas felt fundamentally changed. Not healed, perhaps, but transformed. The guilt remained, would always remain, but it no longer defined him entirely. He was Jonas McCade, former marshal, current rancher, man in love with a remarkable woman who saw his brokenness and chose him anyway. The response to the newspaper article took shape over the next week. Jonas wrote it carefully, striking a balance between defending Eleanor and telling the larger story of what she'd accomplished in Silverdale. He included testimonials from every parent, quotes from students, observations from community leaders. He framed it not as a defensive reaction, but as a corrective truth, evidence that judging someone by their actions rather than accusations revealed a different reality entirely. Reverend Walsh helped polish the language, ensuring it remained respectful while being forceful. Peter Chen coordinated with his supplier connections to ensure the response reached the same newspapers that had published the attack article. And when everything was ready, 47 Silverdale residents signed it, their names a collective statement that they stood with their teacher regardless of what distant powers claimed. The response appeared in newspapers across 3 territories in January. Its impact was immediate and unexpected. Other teachers who'd been similarly attacked wrote their own stories, creating a wave of articles about women destroyed by false accusations. Reform-minded newspapers picked up the theme, questioning why powerful men faced no consequences for spreading lies while women's lives were ruined based on mere allegations. The senator, unused to having his actions scrutinized, found himself on the defensive for the first time. Within weeks, the tide had turned. The journalist who'd written the attack piece was revealed to be on the senator's payroll, destroying his credibility. The senator's son, facing actual scrutiny, admitted under pressure that he'd been rejected and had exaggerated his claims. While no official retraction was issued, powerful families rarely admitted wrongdoing that completely. The implication was clear. Eleanor Graves had told the truth, and the senator's family had lied. The vindication should have felt triumphant, but Eleanor was simply exhausted. The weeks of fighting had taken their toll, leaving her drained and questioning whether the cost of truth had been worth the pain. Jonas found her one evening in the schoolhouse, staring at a letter from the territorial governor officially commending her service and apologizing for the harassment she'd endured. "You did it," Jonas said quietly, sitting beside her. "You won." "Did I?" Eleanor asked, her voice flat. "The truth came out, yes, but only after weeks of public scrutiny, only after dozens of people had to defend me, only after fighting a battle I should never have had to fight. And the senator? He faces no real consequences. His son admitted to lying and will probably still be elected to something eventually. Where's the justice in that?" Jonas had no easy answer. She was right. The world remained fundamentally unfair, rewarding power and punishing honesty with depressing regularity. But he'd learned something in 8 years of carrying guilt, something Eleanor had taught him through her stubborn determination to live despite scandal. "Justice and survival aren't the same thing," he said finally. "You didn't get justice. The senator should face consequences and won't. But you survived. More than survived. You built a life despite his attempts to destroy you. You're still teaching, still helping children, still creating meaning despite meaninglessness. That's not justice, but it's something. Maybe it's even better than justice, because it's entirely yours. He couldn't take it away." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, some of the tension draining from her body. "When did you get so philosophical?" "When I fell in love with a school teacher who asked impossible questions," Jonas replied, and was rewarded with Eleanor's tired laugh. They sat there as darkness fell around them, 2 people who'd survived their respective battles, not unscathed but still standing, and Jonas realized that was enough, maybe more than enough. By February, life in Silverdale had settled into a new normal. Eleanor's reputation was not just restored but enhanced. She was the teacher who'd stood up to powerful corruption and won. Her students adored her, their parents trusted her completely, and the Territorial Education Board held her up as an example of frontier teaching excellence. Jonas had fully reintegrated into community life, no longer the ghost haunting the corner table, but an active participant in Silverdale's future. He served on the town council, helped mediate disputes, even reluctantly agreed to tell his martial stories to Eleanor's older students, turning his experiences into lessons about justice and consequences and the weight of responsibility. The schoolhouse had become a genuine gathering place, a symbol of what community could accomplish through collective effort. Jonas found himself there most evenings, helping Eleanor prepare lessons or simply keeping her company while she worked. It felt right, being there, being part of something larger than his own guilt and isolation. On a cold evening in late February, as they walked from the schoolhouse back to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Jonas noticed Eleanor was quieter than usual. Something was on her mind, working itself toward expression, and he'd learned to give her space to find her words. "I've been thinking about your ranch," Eleanor said finally as they reached the boarding house steps. "About that meadow behind your house. You said I should hope for you until you remembered how to hope for yourself. I think maybe it's time you started hoping for yourself again." Jonas felt his heart rate increase, understanding this was leading somewhere significant. "What kind of hope are you suggesting?" Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "The kind where we stop waiting for the perfect moment and just start living. The kind where you ask me what you've been planning to ask since that night in the church. The kind where we build the future instead of just surviving the present." Jonas felt his breath catch. "Are you sure?" "We agreed to wait until everything was settled." "Everything is settled," Eleanor interrupted. "As settled as it's going to be. The senator has retreated, my position is secure, the school is thriving. We could wait for more perfect circumstances, but Jonas, life is never perfect. We've both learned that the hard way. So why are we waiting?" Jonas realized she was right. They'd been in holding pattern, waiting for some imaginary moment of certainty that would never arrive. Life didn't offer certainty. It offered only choices and consequences and the bravery to move forward despite incomplete information. He dropped to one knee right there on Mrs. Henderson's porch, not caring that it wasn't romantic or carefully planned or anything like what Eleanor deserved. "Eleanor Graves," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you sat down at my table without asking permission and changed my entire life. You taught me that broken things can be useful, that guilt doesn't have to be a permanent prison, that maybe I deserve happiness even though I took someone else's chance at it. You're brave and brilliant and so completely wonderful that I can't believe you're willing to build a life with someone as damaged as me. Will you marry me?" Eleanor was crying and laughing simultaneously, exactly as she had in the church months ago. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and into her arms. "Yes, absolutely yes, though I should point out that you never actually bought me a ring." "Tomorrow," Jonas promised, holding her tight. "First thing, we'll go to Peter Chen's store and you can pick out anything you want." "I don't need anything fancy," Eleanor said, her face buried against his chest. "Just something that says I'm yours and you're mine." "That's all I want too," Jonas said quietly. "To be yours. To build something together. To prove that two broken people can create a life worth living." They stood there on the porch for a long time, holding each other as February wind howled around them and Silverdale settled into its winter night. Mrs. Henderson eventually appeared at the door, took one look at them, and smiled knowingly before disappearing back inside without a word. They married on a Sunday in late March, when the worst of winter had passed, but spring hadn't quite arrived. The ceremony was held in the small white church that had witnessed so much of their journey, with what seemed like all of Silverdale crammed into the pews. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Jonas wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, feeling both terrified and more certain than he'd felt about anything in 8 years. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge what both Jonas and Eleanor had survived, the brokenness they'd brought to this moment, and the brave choice they were making to build something together despite incomplete healing. There was no pretense that marriage would fix everything, no suggestion that love erased past pain. Instead, Walsh spoke of companionship in darkness, of being broken together, of choosing daily to honor commitment, even when circumstances made it difficult. When Jonas slipped the simple gold band onto Eleanor's finger, he felt the weight of the moment, not just promising to love her, but choosing to believe he deserved to be loved in return. It was the hardest thing he'd done since turning in his badge, this act of accepting grace instead of punishment, connection instead of isolation. "I love you," he whispered as they kissed to seal their vows. And Eleanor whispered it back, and Jonas felt 8 years of accumulated darkness finally, fully receding under the light of being chosen, of being wanted, of being loved, despite every reason he didn't deserve it. The reception was held in the town hall, the same space where the community had rallied to defend Eleanor against the senator's attacks. There was food and music and dancing, Jonas surprising Eleanor with how much his rusty waltzing had improved through practice. Students performed a song they'd learned specifically for the occasion, their young voices filling the hall with joy and hope. As the evening wore on and Jonas danced with his wife, a concept still too wonderful to fully process, he caught glimpses of the life they were building. Samuel Morton promising to help expand Jonas's ranch house to accommodate a growing family. Peter Chen offering to order whatever supplies Eleanor needed to create a reading room in the school. Mrs. Henderson tearfully telling Eleanor that she'd be missed at the boarding house, but that marriage was worth the sacrifice. And through it all, Jonas felt Sarah Mitchell's presence, not as accusation, but as witness. He would never stop carrying guilt for her death, would never claim his happiness somehow balanced that loss. But he could honor her memory by living fully, by helping children learn, by building meaning from tragedy. He could be the kind of man who caught people when they fell, who rebuilt schools and communities and his own broken heart through stubborn determination and love. When the celebration finally ended and Jonas took Eleanor back to the ranch, their ranch now, he showed her the changes he'd made in preparation for her arrival. The porch overlooking the meadow, exactly as she'd envisioned. The bedroom expanded to accommodate them both. The small room beside it, empty but waiting, ready to become a nursery when the time came. Eleanor walked through their home with wonder, touching each carefully constructed surface, seeing in every detail Jonas's love made tangible. When she reached the porch and looked out over the meadow, now covered in melting snow with the first hints of wildflowers emerging, she turned to Jonas with tears in her eyes. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It's ours," Jonas replied. "Everything I have, everything I am, it's yours now. We'll build the rest together." They stood on that porch as stars emerged overhead. Two people who'd found each other through brokenness and chosen to believe that their story could end with hope instead of tragedy. Jonas thought about the man he'd been 8 years ago, guilty and isolated and convinced he deserved nothing but punishment. He thought about the night Eleanor had sat at his table without asking permission, the first crack in the armor he'd built from grief. He thought about all the moments between then and now, the falling and catching, the conversations and confessions, the community rallying and the hard-won victories. He thought about how easy it would have been to refuse that first night, to maintain his isolation, to never discover what existed beyond survival. "Thank you," he said quietly to Eleanor, who stood beside him wrapped in his embrace. "For what?" she asked. "For sitting down without asking," Jonas said. "For refusing to accept my refusal. For teaching me that broken things can be useful. For loving me when I didn't know how to love myself." Eleanor tilted her face up to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Thank you for catching me," she replied, "for standing with me, for being brave enough to believe we could build this together, for proving that redemption is possible if you're willing to do the work." They went inside eventually, leaving the porch and the meadow and the emerging stars behind. Inside their home, they would build the life they'd promised each other. Not perfect, never without shadows, but honest and brave and full of the kind of love that grows from truly knowing someone, brokenness and all. Jonas McCade had eaten alone for 8 years, convinced that isolation was what he deserved, that connection would be a betrayal of the girl whose death he carried. But Eleanor Graves had sat down without asking permission, had seen his guilt and offered grace instead of judgment, had chosen him despite every logical reason to choose someone less damaged. And in choosing each other, two broken people had created something neither could have built alone, a life that honored their pasts without being imprisoned by them, a love that acknowledged darkness while actively choosing light, a future that proved redemption wasn't earned through suffering but accepted through courage. The cowboy who ate alone for years now set 2 plates each night, and the table that had once been a monument to isolation became a symbol of connection. Their ranch would grow over the years. The house expanding, children arriving, the meadow blooming with wildflowers each spring. The schoolhouse would thrive under Eleanor's continued dedication. Generations of students learning not just reading and arithmetic, but the deeper lesson their teacher embodied. That you are more than your worst moment. That survival can transform into thriving. That choosing to live fully is the highest honor you can pay to those who've lost that chance. Jonas never forgot Sarah Mitchell, never stopped carrying the weight of her death, but he learned to carry it while building instead of hiding, while loving instead of isolating, while proving through daily choice that broken things, when carefully tended and courageously defended, could become something stronger than they'd ever been whole. And every night, as he sat across the table from Eleanor in the home they'd built together, Jonas silently thanked the stubborn schoolteacher who'd refused to accept his rejection, who'd seen past his walls to the man still capable of connection, who'd loved him back to life one conversation, one dance, one shared meal at a time. The lonely cowboy's table was never lonely again. And in that simple transformation from isolation to connection, from guilt to grace, from surviving to living, Jonas and Eleanor proved that the most powerful redemption stories aren't about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of it.